They say you never forget the moment your entire world shatters. Mine shattered in front of 50 people at my father's 65th birthday party. "Heather isn't my biological daughter," he announced, champagne glass raised. "DNA testing proved it years ago, so the $50 million estate will go to my real children." The room erupted. Some gasped, some whispered. A few actually laughed like my public humiliation was entertainment over dessert. I should have screamed, should have cried, should have defended myself. Instead, I stood up, walked to the head table, and placed my gift in front of him. Just a single photograph in a frame. Then, while everyone watched in confused silence, I tore that photo into pieces slowly, deliberately, and let them fall like confetti onto his birthday cake. "Happy birthday, Dad," I whispered. "I hope you enjoy what's coming." I walked out with my head high and my heart in pieces. But here's what my father didn't know: I wasn't broken. I was calculating. Because that DNA test he'd used to destroy me, it was a lie. A 37-year-old lie built by someone he trusted completely. Someone who'd been planning my destruction since before I could even speak. What you're about to hear isn't just a story about inheritance or betrayal. It's about a revenge so patient it waited decades. A secret so dark it destroyed everyone who touched it. And a gift, one final gift, that would haunt my father until his very last breath. Stay with me. Because by the end, you'll understand some truths don't set you free. They burn everything down. My name is Heather Brown. I'm 37 years old, and until very recently, I worked as a healthcare administrator at a mid-sized hospital in Connecticut. I've built a decent life for myself: modest apartment, reliable car, a job that pays the bills and occasionally makes me feel like I'm helping people. But if you'd asked me a year ago what I was most proud of, I wouldn't have had a good answer. Because the truth is, I spent most of my life trying to earn something that was never going to be given my father's love. Before that birthday party destroyed everything I thought I knew, I'd already spent 37 years feeling like I didn't quite fit. Not in a dramatic, rebellious way. More like a puzzle piece that's almost the right shape, but not quite, so it sits there on the edge of the table while everyone else clicks perfectly into place. My earliest memory isn't a happy one. I was maybe 5 years old, standing in the kitchen doorway, watching my father Richard lift my little sister Lily into the air. She was squealing with delight, and he was laughing. Really laughing, the kind of deep, genuine joy that transformed his usually stern face into something warm and approachable. I remember thinking, I want that. So I ran over, arms up, hoping for the same treatment. He set Lily down, looked at me, and his smile just faded. Not dramatically. He didn't scowl or push me away. He just went neutral, like someone had flipped a switch. "Heather, I'm busy," he said, and walked past me to get his coffee. I stood there with my arms still raised, and Lily looked at me with this confused expression, like she couldn't understand why I'd been excluded from something so obvious. That became the pattern. Lily got the warmth. I got the distance. It wasn't that he was cruel to me. He never hit me, never screamed, never called me names. But he was cold in a way that's hard to explain to people who haven't experienced it. When Lily brought home a report card with B's and 1 C, he'd take her out for ice cream and tell her how proud he was that she was trying her best. When I brought home straight A's, he'd glance at the paper and say, "Good, keep it up." No celebration, no pride in his voice, just acknowledgement that I'd met the minimum expectation. When Lily broke curfew at 16, he sat her down and said, "I know you're finding yourself. Just be safe." When I came home 20 minutes late from the library at 17, he grounded me for 2 weeks, because responsibility matters, Heather. The standards weren't just different, they were impossible for me and non-existent for her. I remember when Lily wanted to go to this expensive private college across the country. She'd gotten in, but didn't have a full scholarship. My father wrote the check without blinking. $50,000 a year, and he said, "Nothing's too good for my girl." 3 years later, when I was applying to state schools and asked if he could help with the gap between my financial aid and tuition, maybe $5,000, he told me that taking out loans would build character and teach me the value of education. I took out the loans. I worked 2 jobs while going to school full-time. I graduated with honors and $30,000 in debt. He came to my graduation but left before the reception because he had a golf game. For years, I told myself this was normal. I convinced myself that some parents just connect better with certain children, that it didn't mean anything that I was being too sensitive. I watched other families at restaurants and parks, at school events, and I'd see fathers treating all their children with equal warmth, and I'd think, well, maybe I'm just harder to love. That's what emotional neglect does to you. It's so subtle that you internalize it. You don't think, my father is treating me unfairly. You think, what's wrong with me that I can't earn his love? And Margaret, my stepmother, though I'd called her mom since I was old enough to talk, she was always there with an explanation. She'd been part of our family since I was 3 after my biological mother died. Margaret was the one who raised me, who packed my lunches and signed my permission slips and attended my parent-teacher conferences. She was appropriate in all the ways that matter on the surface. She said the right things. She showed up. But there was always something missing, something I couldn't name as a child, but recognized now as genuine warmth. When I'd come to her confused and hurt by my father's coldness, she'd put her arm around me and say things like, "Your father's just tired from work, sweetheart. He doesn't mean to be distant." Or, "He shows love differently than you might expect. Not everyone is demonstrative." Or my personal favorite, "Maybe if you approached him differently, he'd respond better. Have you thought about that?" Every comment was a tiny redirection of blame. Every explanation positioned me as the problem. She never said it directly. Margaret was far too intelligent for that, but the message was clear. If my father and I couldn't connect, it was because I wasn't trying hard enough, wasn't understanding enough, wasn't enough, period. I didn't realize until much later that Margaret wasn't a bridge between my father and me. She was a wall. Every time we might have connected, she was there with a comment or a concern or a reinterpretation that kept us apart. She translated his actions in ways that made his coldness seem reasonable and my hurt seem childish. She was so good at it that I never once in all those years thought to question her motives. And my biological mother, Sarah, the woman who'd actually given birth to me, she might as well have never existed. There wasn't a single photograph of her in our house. Not in the albums, not on the walls, not tucked away in drawers. When I was young, maybe 7 or 8, I asked Margaret what my real mom looked like. She got this pinched expression and said, "It's better not to dwell on sad things, honey. I'm your mother now. Isn't that enough?" I learned to stop asking. The few times I brought Sarah up to my father, he'd changed the subject so quickly and completely that it was clear the topic was forbidden. So I grew up with this sense that I'd come from nowhere, that I'd just appeared one day with no history, no maternal connection, no proof that anyone had ever truly wanted me to exist. I was a ghost child, drifting through someone else's family, never quite belonging, never understanding why. I spent my entire childhood and most of my adulthood trying to solve a puzzle I didn't have all the pieces to. What had I done wrong? What was broken in me that made me so hard to love? How could I fix it? How could I be better, quieter, more helpful, more perfect, so that one day my father would look at me, the way he looked at Lily, with genuine warmth and unconditional acceptance? I thought the emptiness was mine to carry until I learned someone had carved it into me. The worst part wasn't the coldness itself. It was watching my sister receive everything I'd been denied and not being able to hate her for it. Family dinners were where the contrast was most stark, most undeniable. We'd all sit around the same table eating the same food, supposedly existing as one unit. But we might as well have been in different universes. I remember one particular dinner when I was 15 and Lily was 11. She'd just gotten her report card, 3 B's, 2 C's, and 1 A in art. My father looked at it, smiled this warm, indulgent smile, and said, "That's my girl. I'm so proud of you for trying your best." And then he announced we'd all go out for ice cream after dinner to celebrate her hard work. I'd gotten my report card the same day. 6 A's, including in AP courses that Lily's grade level didn't even offer yet. I'd put it on my father's desk that morning before school, hoping maybe this time would be different. He'd glanced at it during dinner between bites of chicken and said, "Good, Heather. Keep those grades up." Then he turned back to Lily and asked her about her art project. We went out for ice cream to celebrate Lily's mediocre report card. My straight A's weren't mentioned again. This wasn't a one-time thing. This was every time, every achievement, every milestone. When Lily made the JV soccer team her freshman year, not even varsity, just JV, my father took a half-day off work to watch her first game. When I graduated summa cum laude from college, he came to the ceremony but left before the reception because he had a golf game scheduled. He didn't even stay for photos. The double standard extended to discipline too. I'll never forget the night Lily came home at 2 a.m, 3 hours past curfew, smelling like beer. She was 16. My father sat her down in the kitchen and I could hear the conversation from my room upstairs where I was studying. His voice was gentle, concerned. "Lily, honey, I know you're at an age where you're exploring, finding yourself. I just want you to be safe. Call me next time, okay? I'll come get you, no questions asked." She was grounded for exactly 2 days. A year earlier, I'd come home 27 minutes late because the library had kept me past closing while I finished a research paper. 27 minutes. My father had been waiting at the door. He didn't ask where I'd been or why. He just said, "This is disrespect, Heather. Pure disrespect. 2 weeks, no phone, no car, straight home after school." When I tried to explain about the library, he cut me off. "Responsibility matters. Apparently you need to learn that." Even our extended family noticed, though no one ever said anything directly. I'd see aunts and uncles exchange glances at holiday gatherings when my father would heap praise on Lily for minor things while barely acknowledging my actual accomplishments. My grandmother once started to say something, "Richard, don't you think Heather deserves—" But my grandfather touched her arm and she stopped mid-sentence. Family loyalty. I learned meant protecting the comfortable lie that everything was fine, that this was just normal family dynamics, nothing to see here. The college tuition situation almost broke me. Lily had her heart set on this private liberal arts college in California, tuition running close to $50,000 a year. She'd gotten in, but with minimal financial aid. I remember sitting at the kitchen table when she showed my father the acceptance letter and financial aid package. He barely hesitated. "Of course you're going, sweetheart. Nothing's too good for my girl. I'll handle the finances." Just like that. $50,000 a year for 4 years, and he was thrilled to pay it. 3 years later, I'd been accepted to a state school with a partial scholarship. I needed about $5,000 to cover the gap between my aid package and the total cost. I'd saved some money from my job, but not enough. I asked my father if he could help just with that gap. He looked at me like I'd asked him to buy me a yacht. "Heather, you need to learn financial responsibility. Taking out student loans will teach you the value of education. It'll build character." I took out the loans. I worked 2 jobs all through college. I graduated with $30,000 in debt, while Lily graduated from her expensive private school debt-free. And through all of it, Margaret was there with her perfectly calibrated comments, always positioning herself as the reasonable voice, the mediator, the one trying to help everyone get along. When I'd achieve something, make the honor roll, get into a competitive program, land a good job, Margaret would offer praise that somehow felt more like criticism. "That's wonderful, dear," she'd say in front of my father. "Though I'm sure Lily will do just as well when she's your age. She's so naturally gifted, don't you think, Richard?" The comparison was always there, subtle but clear, with the implicit message that Lily's future success would be effortless, while mine required grinding effort. When my father would criticize me, which was often, Margaret would jump in to defend me in ways that actually made things worse. "She didn't mean to disappoint you, Richard. She tries so hard, poor thing." I didn't realize for years what she was doing. the word disappoint inserted where succeed should have been. Tries so hard, implying that I was struggling failing despite maximum effort rather than actually achieving what I'd set out to do. She'd make me sound pathetic while appearing to be supportive. I found out years later completely by accident that Margaret had been intercepting communication between Lily and me. When I was in college, I'd send birthday cards to Lily every year. She never responded, and I assumed she just didn't care about maintaining a relationship with me. Turns out she never received a single card. Margaret had told her I was going through a phase and needed space, and that it was better not to push contact. Meanwhile, she'd told me that Lily was busy with her own life and wasn't ready to connect right now. For 5 years, we barely spoke because Margaret had convinced each of us that the other didn't want a relationship. She was even more insidious than that. She'd manufacture conflicts out of thin air. She'd tell my father that I'd said something critical about him, something I never said, and then watch as he grew distant and cold. She'd tell Lily that I was jealous of her, that I'd made catty comments about her intelligence or her achievements, none of which were true. She'd plant these little bombs and then stand back with this concerned, sad expression while relationships exploded around her. Looking back now with adult perspective, I can see what I couldn't see then. Every single time my father and I had a genuine moment, every time we seemed to be connecting, Margaret would find a way to interrupt it. I remember once, I must have been 12, my father and I were in the garage together. He was showing me how to change the oil in the car, and for once we were just talking. Really talking about school and books, and nothing important. But it felt good. Normal. Like maybe we could have a real relationship. Margaret came out and said sweetly, "Richard, Heather has that big test tomorrow she should be studying for. Remember, you wouldn't want her grades to slip." The moment ended. He sent me inside. We never had another moment like that. She did the same with Lily. Anytime my sister and I seemed to be bonding, Margaret would suddenly schedule something that pulled us apart. "Oh, Lily, I forgot you have that dentist appointment." "Heather, weren't you supposed to help me with grocery shopping?" Always with a smile, always with a reasonable excuse, always effective at keeping us separate. And the photographs. God, the family photographs. I didn't notice it at the time because the exclusion was so gradual, so subtle. But when I was packing up my apartment last year, I found an old album from my teenage years. I started looking through it really carefully. In group family photos, I was consistently slightly out of frame, not completely cut out, but positioned at the very edge, easy to crop out later. In important photos, holidays, celebrations, milestones, I was often just absent entirely. Margaret would have taken the photo, or she'd say, "Oh, Heather, could you run inside and grab my purse?" And by the time I got back, the photo op was over. It wasn't dramatic enough to call out. It wasn't obvious enough to prove. But the cumulative effect over 18 years was clear. I didn't quite fit in this picture. I didn't quite belong. And because it happened so slowly, so carefully, no one questioned it. It felt natural, inevitable, just the way things were. She never pushed me out. She made the space too small for me to fit. I was too young when it all started to understand what was happening. I was 3 years old when my mother Sarah died of cancer. I don't remember her, not really. Sometimes I think I remember the smell of her perfume or the sound of her laugh, but I'm never sure if those are real memories or just things I've constructed from desperate need. What I do know from family stories told much later is that when Sarah died, my father completely fell apart. He couldn't function. Couldn't cook, couldn't manage the household, could barely get himself out of bed in the morning. I was this confused toddler who kept asking where Mommy went, and he had no idea how to answer me, how to take care of me, how to do anything except grieve. Then Margaret appeared. She was introduced to me as Mommy's friend from college. This kind woman who was going to help us for a little while. I was told she'd come to make sure Daddy and I were okay. Everyone said we were so lucky to have her, that she was an angel sent to save us in our darkest time. Looking back now, knowing what I know, I find it strange how perfectly timed her arrival was. How completely prepared she seemed for the role. how quickly she took over every aspect of our lives. She organized my mother's funeral with quiet, terrifying efficiency. While my father was catatonic with grief, Margaret handled everything: the service, the flowers, the reception, all the logistics that come with death. She fielded phone calls, accepted casseroles from neighbors, made sure I was fed and bathed and put to bed on time. She managed our household like she'd been doing it for years, like she already knew where everything was, what needed to be done, how to keep a grieving family from completely disintegrating. Everyone called her a godsend. "Thank God Margaret was there," aunts and uncles would say. "I don't know what Richard would have done without her. That poor man needed someone, and she just stepped right in, bless her heart." Within a year, one single year after my mother's death, Margaret and my father were married. I was 4 years old, and suddenly this woman who'd been helping became my new mother. The family was thrilled. Heather needs a mother figure. Richard can't raise a little girl alone. It's what Sarah would have wanted for her daughter to be taken care of. No one seemed to question how quickly profound grief had transformed into new romance. No one asked why Margaret had appeared so conveniently, so perfectly prepared to fill the void Sarah left. No one wondered why a woman who was supposedly Sarah's best friend from college hadn't been around before the funeral, hadn't visited during the illness, seemed to materialize only after Sarah was safely dead. But I'd learned the truth about that much later. Margaret and Sarah hadn't been close friends. They'd barely spoken in years before Sarah's death. The best friend story was a lie. But by the time I discovered that Margaret had already rewritten the entire history. She didn't arrive in our lives as an interloper. She was too smart for that. She made herself absolutely indispensable before anyone thought to question her presence. She knew my father's routines, his preferences, his vulnerabilities. She knew exactly which emotional buttons to press and when. It was like she'd studied him, learned him, prepared for this role with meticulous attention to detail. She anticipated his needs before he voiced them. When he'd come home from work, exhausted, dinner was ready, the house was clean. I was already bathed and in pajamas. When he worried about being a good father, she was there with child development books and gentle suggestions. When he felt guilty about moving on from Sarah so quickly, Margaret would say in that soft, understanding voice, "Richard, Sarah would want you to be happy. She'd want Heather to have a stable home. You're not betraying her memory. You're honoring it by making sure her daughter is taken care of." She positioned herself as the voice of reason, the steady hand, the woman who understood him better than he understood himself. And my father, broken and desperate and terrified of being alone with his grief, and his daughter latched onto her like a life raft. By the time they married, he genuinely couldn't imagine life without her, which was exactly what she'd calculated. She'd made herself irreplaceable before revealing she intended to stay permanently. Her next project was erasing Sarah entirely. It happened gradually, so slowly that no one really noticed it was deliberate. Photographs of my mother started disappearing from walls and mantels. When I asked where they went, Margaret would say gently, "We packed them away, sweetheart. It's too sad for you to see your mommy everywhere when she can't come back." My mother's clothes, her jewelry, her books, her artwork, everything that proved she'd existed was donated to charity. "No point dwelling on the past," Margaret would say. "We need to move forward as a new family." Even saying Sarah's name became taboo. If I mentioned my mother, Margaret would get this pained expression and say, "Best not to confuse yourself with talk of someone you can't remember, honey. It'll only make you sad." My father, already uncomfortable with emotion, readily agreed with this approach. Grief was messy. Forgetting was easier. Margaret positioned herself not as my mother's replacement, but as my real mother. "I'm the one raising you," she'd say when I was older and starting to ask questions. "I'm the one who's here, who takes care of you, who loves you. That's what matters." She told me carefully edited stories about your mother and me in college, always centering herself in the narrative, always making Sarah sound peripheral, almost unimportant. My mother became a supporting character in Margaret's story, a sad footnote, a tragedy that led to something better: Margaret's arrival. Within 5 years of Sarah's death, my mother had been reduced to nothing. No photos, no belongings, no stories, no presents. Margaret had become the author of our family's history, and she'd written Sarah out of it completely. To everyone else, Margaret was perfect. She volunteered at my elementary school room mother every year. She attended every recital, every school play, every parent-teacher conference. She baked elaborate birthday cakes and hosted dinner parties where she played the gracious hostess. She was the devoted wife, the caring stepmother, the pillar of the community. People would tell my father constantly how lucky he was, how wonderful Margaret was, what a blessing she'd been to our broken family. But I felt the truth underneath the performance. Her hugs were mechanical, efficient, like checking a box on a list. Her praise always came with comparison. Good job, though I'm sure other children did well too. Her love evaporated the moment witnesses left. In public, she was warm. In private, she was ice. I learned early that Margaret's affection came with terms. Unspoken, but absolutely clear. I'll play the good mother in public if you play the grateful, uncomplicated daughter. Stay small, stay quiet. Don't need too much. Don't ask difficult questions. Don't cause problems. Don't remind anyone that I'm not actually your mother, that your real mother died, that I stepped into a dead woman's shoes and claimed her life as my own. When I broke character, when I cried too much, asked about Sarah, needed attention at an inconvenient time, showed emotion that made things messy. There were consequences, not dramatic ones. Margaret was too intelligent for anything obvious. But her demeanor would cool. Small kindnesses would be withdrawn. She'd mentioned to my father in passing that I'd been difficult lately, or attention-seeking, or going through a phase. The temperature in the house would drop by degrees, and I'd learn to be smaller, quieter, less present. I learned that Margaret's love was a performance, and the cost of the show was my authentic self. I had to shrink to fit the role she'd written for me. Had to be grateful, undemanding, invisible when necessary. Had to let her be the star of this family drama, while I played the supporting role, the damaged daughter who should be thankful someone was willing to raise me at all. She taught me to be small so she could loom large. It wasn't until I was in my late 20s that I really started trying to find my mother. Not Margaret, my actual mother, Sarah, the woman who'd given birth to me and then disappeared from history so completely it was like she'd never existed at all. I think what triggered it was turning 27, the age Sarah had been when she died. Something about reaching that milestone made me desperate to understand who she was, to find any connection to the woman whose DNA I carried, but whose face I couldn't remember. I needed to know that I'd come from somewhere, that I wasn't just this hollow person who'd materialized out of nothing into a family that didn't really want me. I started with the basics. My birth certificate was easy enough to obtain standard information, nothing unusual. Sarah Elizabeth Webb, married to Richard Brown. Daughter Heather Sarah Brown, born 9 months after their marriage. Everything normal, everything legal, everything suggesting I'd been wanted and planned. But that's where the easy part ended. I tried to get medical records next. Surely there had to be documentation of my mother's pregnancy, my birth, her cancer treatment, something. I contacted the hospital where I'd been born. They had no records. Sometimes older files get purged after 25 years. The records clerk told me apologetically. I tried the hospital where Sarah had supposedly been treated for cancer. Same story. No records found. I contacted 2 other hospitals in the area. Nothing. It was like my mother had given birth to me and died without ever having interacted with the medical system at all, which was impossible. The photographs were even more frustrating. There wasn't a single picture of Sarah anywhere in my father's house. I already knew that. But I started reaching out to extended family members, aunts and uncles and cousins who would have known Sarah, who must have taken pictures at holidays and birthdays and family gatherings. "Do you have any photos of my mother?" I'd ask. Anything at all. The responses were eerily similar. "Oh, honey, I wish I did, but I lost everything in a move years ago. I think I might have had some, but I can't find them now. You know, I'm sure we took pictures, but I have no idea what happened to them." It was like there had been a coordinated purge. Every single person I contacted had somehow lost or misplaced every photograph they'd ever taken of Sarah Brown. When I tried to ask these relatives about Sarah herself, about what she was like, the answers were suspiciously vague and strangely uniform. Oh, Sarah was lovely, very quiet, very sweet. She and Margaret were close. I think they knew each other from college. It was so long ago, dear. Memories fade. I'm sorry I can't tell you more. Every response felt rehearsed, like they'd all been told what to say and what not to say. No one could give me a specific memory, a particular story, anything that would make Sarah feel like a real person who'd actually lived. I even went to the cemetery where Sarah was supposedly buried. My father had mentioned it once in passing years ago. I drove out there on a cold Saturday in November, spent 2 hours walking through sections reading headstones. I finally found the plot, Brown family section, several relatives buried there. There was a space for Sarah. But no headstone, just empty ground and a small metal marker with a number on it, the kind they use temporarily until a permanent stone is placed. I called my father that night. "Why doesn't Mom have a headstone?" Long silence. Then, I was too grief-stricken at the time to choose one. It seemed too final. And then after I married Margaret, it felt awkward, like I was honoring my first wife in a way that might hurt my current wife. I kept meaning to take care of it, but the years just passed. 34 years. He'd let 34 years pass without giving his first wife, the mother of his child, even a headstone with her name on it. In desperation, I hired a genealogist. I gave her everything I had, which wasn't much, and asked her to find anything she could about Sarah Elizabeth Webb Brown. She came back 3 weeks later with a thin folder. Birth records, yes. High school records, yes. College attendance at State University confirmed. Marriage to Richard Brown documented. And then, nothing. The 5 years between her marriage and her death were almost completely blank. No employment records, no medical records, no paper trail of any kind. "It's unusual," the genealogist said carefully. "Not impossible, but unusual. It's like she just existed quietly for those years without leaving much documentation. Or," she paused, "or someone went to significant effort to remove records." Every time I tried to bring up Sarah with Margaret, I could feel the temperature in the room drop. Her entire demeanor would shift in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. The muscles around her eyes would tighten. Her smile would become strained. Her voice would take on this artificial lightness that was somehow more frightening than if she'd just gotten angry. "Why dwell on sad things, Heather?" she'd say with that smile that never reached her eyes. "Your father finds it very painful to discuss Sarah. You wouldn't want to hurt him by bringing up that tragedy, would you? Or, I'm the one who raised you from the time you were a toddler. I'm the one who was there for every milestone, every scraped knee, every bad dream. Isn't that what truly matters? Why do you need to dig up the past?" The message was always clear, without being explicitly stated. Asking about Sarah was a betrayal. It was ingratitude. It was me rejecting Margaret's years of sacrifice, raising another woman's child. It was inappropriate, harmful, disrespectful. So I learned to stop asking, at least out loud. But the questions kept festering in my mind, growing bigger and more insistent with each dead end, each missing piece, each suspicious gap. Why had my mother been so thoroughly erased? Why did Margaret react with such barely controlled hostility every time Sarah's name came up? What was she protecting my father from? Or more accurately, what was she hiding from me? Why did a woman who'd been dead for 3 decades still have the power to make Margaret's mask slip? I started noticing inconsistencies in Margaret's story. She consistently told people that she and Sarah had been best friends since college, that they'd been roommates, that Sarah's death had devastated her. But when I looked through old college records and yearbooks, I couldn't find any evidence they'd even attended the same school. Sarah had gone to State University. Margaret had attended a private college 3 states away. They'd overlapped in years, but not in location. So when exactly had this deep friendship formed? And the timeline of Margaret's arrival didn't make sense either. She claimed she'd rushed to my father's side immediately after Sarah's death to help. But the marriage certificate told a different story. Sarah died in March. Margaret and my father married in December 9 months later. That's not immediately. That's barely enough time for appropriate grieving, let alone a courtship, a proposal, planning a wedding. Unless they'd been together before Sarah died, or unless Margaret had moved in and made herself indispensable so quickly that marriage became inevitable. Margaret maintained this image in public of honoring Sarah's memory, of speaking warmly about her deceased friend. Sarah was such a special person, she'd tell people at social gatherings. I miss her every day. But to me privately, she never spoke of Sarah at all. Not once. Not a single story, not a single memory, not a single acknowledgement that my mother had existed. I finally found a photograph when I was 32 years old. A distant cousin was moving to a nursing home and having an estate sale. I went hoping to find something, anything. Tucked in the back of an old album was a single photo, Sarah maybe 25 years old, standing in a garden smiling at the camera. She had my eyes, my smile. She was real. She had existed. I took the photo home, had it scanned and enlarged, put it in a frame on my bookshelf. When Margaret came to visit and saw it, her reaction was visceral. Her face went hard in a way I'd never seen before. Not sad, not nostalgic, something colder, sharper, almost like rage. "Where did you get that?" Her voice was tight. "Cousin Ellen's estate sale." "I see." She stared at the photo for a long moment, and I swear I saw something like hatred flash across her face. Hatred for a woman who'd been dead for 29 years. "It's not a very good picture of her. You should probably put it away. Your father wouldn't want to be reminded." But it wasn't concern for my father I heard in her voice. It was something else entirely. Something that made me understand with sudden chilling clarity. My mother hadn't simply died and been mourned and gradually forgotten with the passage of time. My mother wasn't just dead. She'd been disappeared. That realization that my mother had been systematically erased rather than naturally forgotten sat in my chest like a stone for months. I didn't know what to do with it. I had no proof, just a growing certainty that something deeply wrong had happened, was still happening. I felt like I was living in a house built on lies, but I couldn't see the foundation clearly enough to understand how it had been constructed or why. Then, 6 months after finding that photograph of Sarah, the invitation arrived. It came in the mail on a Tuesday in an expensive cream-colored envelope with my name and address printed in formal script. The moment I picked it up, something felt wrong. The weight of it, the formality, the impersonal precision of the printing. I opened it standing in my apartment building's lobby, and what I found inside made my stomach drop. "You are cordially invited to Richard Brown's 65th birthday celebration." Not Dad's birthday party. Not, "Please join us for Richard's 65th. Certainly not a handwritten note saying, "We'd love to see you." It was printed on heavy cardstock like a wedding invitation or a corporate event, formal and cold. The date, time, and location were listed with the same impersonal efficiency. RSVP requested by a certain date. It was the kind of invitation you'd send to a business associate or a distant acquaintance, not your daughter. I stood there staring at it, trying to understand why this felt so deeply wrong. I hadn't been invited to a family gathering in almost 2 years. After enough awkward dinners where my presence seemed to create uncomfortable tension, where I'd sit at the table feeling like an intruder in my own family, I'd simply stopped going. And no one had seemed to mind. Holidays came and went without invitations. Lily's birthday celebrations happened without me. I'd accepted that I'd been quietly written out of the family narrative. So why was I being invited now? And why so formally? I turned the envelope over and saw Margaret's handwriting on the back flap. "Richard would be pleased if you attended." Not happy, not thrilled, not, "We'd love to see you." Pleased. Like my attendance would be a satisfactory outcome, a box checked, an obligation fulfilled. The word choice felt deliberate, almost legal in its careful neutrality. I spent the next 3 days debating whether to go. Every instinct I had screamed that this was a trap, that I should throw the invitation away and keep my distance. The last decade of family gatherings had taught me that these events only served to highlight my outsider status, to remind me that I didn't really belong. I'd watch Lily and my father laugh together, watch Margaret play the gracious hostess, and feel like a ghost at my own family's table. Why subject myself to that again? But something about this invitation nagged at me. The timing felt significant. Richard turning 65. That's the age when people finalize retirement plans, make serious decisions about estates and inheritance and legacy. Was this about more than just a birthday? Then Margaret started calling. She'd never called me frequently before. We'd speak maybe once every few months, brief and perfunctory. But suddenly my phone was ringing every other day with Margaret on the other end, her voice warm and insistent in a way that felt performative. "Heather, darling, I hope you got the invitation. It would mean so much to your father if you came. This is an important birthday, you know, a milestone. We really need you there. Family should be together for occasions like this. You wouldn't want to miss it." The pressure was relentless but subtle, wrapped in concern and sweetness. Each call made me more certain that something was planned, something I wasn't going to like. But the not knowing felt worse than walking into whatever trap they'd set. So, against every instinct telling me to protect myself, I sent back the RSVP card. Yes, I would attend. And then I had to decide on a gift. I'd found the photograph months earlier, shortly before the invitation arrived at my grandmother's estate sale. She'd passed away at 92, and the family was clearing out her house. I'd gone hoping to find something of my mother's, some trace of Sarah that had survived Margaret's purge. I'd almost given up when I found it tucked in the back of an old photo album, a single picture that had somehow been overlooked or forgotten. It showed Sarah visibly pregnant, standing next to a much younger version of my father, in front of what must have been their first house together. But what struck me most was my father's face. His hand rested on Sarah's swollen belly, and his expression held something I'd never seen directed at me, pure, unguarded joy. Wonder. Love. He looked like a man who couldn't wait to meet his daughter, who was already completely in love with the child who hadn't been born yet. I turned the photo over and felt my breath catch. Sarah's handwriting shaky but clear. "For our daughter Heather, proof you were wanted from the very first moment." I'd had it professionally framed, paid extra to have the backing photographed and reprinted, so Sarah's message would be visible through the glass. I didn't fully understand why I felt compelled to bring this particular gift to my father's 65th birthday party. It felt important in a way I couldn't articulate. Maybe I needed proof that I had been wanted once, even if that want hadn't survived my mother's death. Maybe I needed to remind my father of what he'd lost, of what he'd allowed to be taken from both of us. Or maybe some part of me knew that whatever was about to happen, I'd need evidence of the truth. Something solid and undeniable to hold on to when everything else was stripped away. The morning of the party, I almost canceled. I'd had a dream that felt less like sleep and more like a recovered memory fighting its way to the surface. I was very small, maybe 4 years old, standing in the hallway with my arms reaching up toward my father. He was smiling, bending down his hands, starting to reach for me. And then Margaret's voice, sharp and cutting, "Richard, don't encourage her neediness." The smile died on his face like someone had flipped a switch. He straightened, turned away without a word, left me standing there with my arms still reaching toward empty air. I woke up with tears on my face, and that familiar ache of rejection so visceral it felt present rather than past. I lay in bed for an hour staring at the ceiling, debating whether I had the strength to walk into whatever they had planned. But I got up. I got dressed in my best suit, applied careful makeup that made me look composed and professional. I styled my hair, put on understated jewelry, examined myself in the mirror until I looked like someone who had her life together, who couldn't be hurt, who couldn't be broken. It was armor, I knew that. I was putting on armor to attend my father's birthday party. I picked up the wrapped photograph, Sarah's smiling face and my father's joy frozen in time, and walked out the door. I would attend. I would survive whatever they'd planned. I would leave with my dignity intact. Whatever happened, I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me shatter. I walked into that party expecting nothing and somehow left with less. The house was lit up like a stage set when I arrived. Valet parking, a catering company unloading equipment, a bartender setting up a full bar in the living room. This wasn't the casual family gatherings I remembered from childhood. This was something else entirely. I walked through the front door I'd walked through 1,000 times before, and it felt foreign. The house was full of people. I counted at least 50 as I made my way through the crowd, and the attendee list told me immediately that this wasn't just a birthday party. Richard's business partners were there, the ones he only saw for important meetings. His lawyer, his financial advisor, country club friends, neighbors who'd never been invited to family events before, relatives I hadn't seen in years, some I barely recognized, community leaders whose names I knew from the newspaper. This was an audience, carefully selected, strategically assembled. A woman I didn't know directed me to find my place card. I moved through the crowd, nodding politely at people who looked at me with expressions I couldn't quite read. Some smiled uncomfortably. Others whispered to their companions when they thought I wasn't looking. The air felt wrong, charged with something I couldn't identify, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. I found my name card at a table in the far back corner of the room. The head table where my father and Margaret and Lily sat was easily 30 feet away. Between us were 4 other tables, all filled with guests. I was physically separated from my family, positioned where I could see them but not hear them, where I was technically present but functionally excluded. The seating arrangement was a statement before anyone had said a word. Outsider, barely tolerated guest, not really family. I sat down next to people I'd never met who introduced themselves as my father's golf buddies. They made polite small talk. I responded automatically while watching the head table. Lily kept glancing at me with an expression I couldn't read. My father looked nervous, kept adjusting his tie, drinking water. And Margaret looked composed and satisfied, like someone who'd planned a successful event and was watching it unfold exactly as intended. Dinner was elaborate. Multiple courses, wine pairings, servers, and white jackets. Throughout the meal, I felt eyes on me. Surreptitious glances from other tables. Whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when I looked up. People knew something I didn't. The anticipation in the room was palpable, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks, that electric heaviness in the air that makes your skin prickle. Margaret kept looking at me. Not obviously, not staring, but I'd catch her eyes on me every few minutes. Her expression was calculating, cold, like someone watching a chess piece they were about to capture. It made the food taste like ash in my mouth. After dessert was served, an elaborate 3-tiered cake, my father stood. Everyone quieted. He picked up his champagne glass, and I expected the usual. "Thank you for coming. Grateful for another year. Let's celebrate together." The standard birthday toast. He started that way. Thanked everyone for being there, for helping him celebrate this milestone. Talked about turning 65, about mortality and legacy, about how reaching this age makes you think about what you'll leave behind when you're gone. Normal enough. A little morbid maybe, but appropriate for the occasion. Then his tone changed, became more formal, harder, almost legalistic in its precision. "This milestone has me thinking seriously about the future," he said. "About my estate, which I've worked 40 years to build. About what I'll leave to my children when I'm gone." I felt something tighten in my chest. Around the room, people leaned forward slightly, sensing the shift in energy. "My true children," he continued, and the emphasis on that word made several people gasp. "Those who are biologically mine. Those who carry my blood." The room went very still. I saw Lily's face go pale. "Some years ago," my father said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room, "I learned through DNA testing that Heather is not biologically my daughter." Time seemed to stop. The words hung in the air, impossible and terrible. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what I was hearing. "Her mother betrayed me," he continued, and his voice held something that sounded like righteousness. I've tried to treat Heather fairly despite this betrayal, tried to do right by a child who isn't mine. But I can no longer pretend. I will not leave my life's work to someone who isn't my daughter. The inheritance, all of it, will go to Lily and my other legitimate heirs. The room erupted. Gasps of shock, murmurs of scandal. A few people, I'll never forget this, actually laughed. Nervous, uncomfortable laughs, but laughs nonetheless, like my public humiliation was entertainment over dessert. A shocking plot twist in an otherwise boring evening. Every single person in that room turned to look at me. 50 pairs of eyes, all watching for my reaction, witnessing my destruction like spectators at some ancient Roman execution. Some faces showed sympathy, others showed curiosity. Most showed that particular kind of fascination people have when watching someone else's life fall apart. I sat frozen. The words wouldn't arrange themselves into meaning. Not his daughter, DNA testing, betrayal, pretend, inheritance, legitimate. Each phrase was a physical blow, but I couldn't feel them yet through the shock, through the numbness that had settled over me like ice water. I saw Lily's face, genuinely shocked, tears already forming in her eyes. She hadn't known. Whatever this was, she hadn't been part of planning it. I saw the lawyer in the corner, the one who'd been at my father's firm for 30 years, taking notes, making this official, legally documented, witnessed by dozens. I saw Margaret's hand on my father's shoulder, comforting him like he was the victim here, like he needed support after this difficult announcement. Her face held concern, sadness, but her eyes held something else, something that looked like satisfaction. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't my father having too much to drink and saying something he shouldn't. This was planned, choreographed, staged, with an audience selected to maximize damage. They'd turned my disinheritance into a public spectacle, ensured that everyone in their social circle would know that Heather Brown wasn't really a Brown, that I was the product of an affair, that I'd been deceiving everyone by existing in this family. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else suggested more champagne, like alcohol would smooth over what had just happened. Margaret began speaking in her gentle, practiced voice. This must be so difficult for everyone. Richard wanted to be honest rather than have rumors spread. I stood. My legs were shaking, but they held me. The wrapped gift I'd brought sat in front of my empty plate. I picked it up. The room watched. I walked through the tables toward the head table, every step feeling like it took a year. The crowd parted. No one spoke. I placed the wrapped photograph directly in front of my father. Didn't say a word. Didn't explain. Didn't defend myself. Didn't beg or plead or cry. The silence said more than any speech could have. Then I turned and walked toward the door. Behind me, I heard paper tearing as my father opened the gift. Heard his sharp intake of breath. Heard someone say, "Oh my God, is that Sarah?" But I didn't turn back. Didn't look. Just kept walking back, straight eyes dry, past 50 people who'd just watched me be publicly destroyed. They expected me to shatter. I refused to give them the satisfaction. I drove for an hour before I could make myself stop. Just drove with no destination, no plan. My hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles went white. I couldn't go home, couldn't face my empty apartment where I'd have to sit with what had just happened. So I just drove, watching streetlights blur past, trying to make my brain process the words my father had spoken in front of 50 people. Not my daughter. DNA testing, betrayal, inheritance going to legitimate heirs. It was 3 days before I could bring myself to answer my phone. Lily had called 17 times, left voicemails that progressed from shock to concern to desperation. "Heather, please. Please call me back. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. Please." When I finally called her back, she was crying before she even said hello. "I didn't know," were the first words out of her mouth. "I swear to God, Heather, I had no idea what he was planning. Mom just said it was an important birthday party that we needed everyone there. I thought I don't even know what I thought. But not that. Never that." "It's fine," I said, and my voice sounded dead even to my own ears. "It's not fine. Nothing about that was fine. What he did, she broke off, crying harder. I ran upstairs the second you left. I couldn't stay in that room. I couldn't look at him. And Heather, the photo you brought, the one of your mom. He opened it after you left, and that's when she told me what happened after I walked out. I didn't ask her to. I didn't want to know. But she needed to tell someone, and I was the only person who'd understand. The party had died the moment I left. The guests who'd been so fascinated by my public humiliation suddenly couldn't get out fast enough. They made awkward excuses, thanked my father, hurriedly avoided eye contact as they gathered coats and found their cars. Within 20 minutes, the house was nearly empty except for family and the catering staff who moved through the rooms like ghosts cleaning up the remains of my destruction. Lily had fled upstairs immediately, unable to process what she'd just witnessed. But she could hear what happened in the dining room, and later Margaret had told her more, defending herself, justifying, explaining. So Lily pieced it together for me, and I sat in my car in an empty parking lot listening to what had happened after I'd walked out of my father's house for what I didn't yet know would be the last time. My father had sat alone at the head table, staring at the wrapped gift I'd left behind. Margaret had put her hand on his arm, urged him not to open it. Don't torture yourself, Richard. She's just trying to manipulate you with sentiment. You know how she can be. But he'd shaken her off. Lily said it was the first time she'd ever seen him ignore Margaret directly and torn at the wrapping paper with shaking hands. The photograph fell out. Sarah, 8 months pregnant, glowing with that particular joy that comes right before everything changes. And next to her, a version of my father I'd never known. Younger and softer, his hand on her swollen belly, his face holding an expression of pure wonder. The kind of love that's so complete, it's almost vulnerable. He'd turned it over. Sarah's handwriting was visible through the glass backing I'd had specially made. Weak and shaky from the illness that would kill her, but clear enough. For our daughter, Heather, proof you were wanted from the very first moment. Lily said his hands started shaking so badly he nearly dropped the frame. He just stared at it, at this evidence of his own joy, his own anticipation, his own love for the daughter he'd just publicly disowned. Margaret had gone very still beside him, watching his face, and Lily said she saw something in Margaret's expression she'd never seen before. Not concern, not sadness. Something harder. Almost like fear. When exactly did you say Sarah told you about the affairs? My father asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret's response was smooth, practiced. During her final illness, darling. She was heavily medicated, confused from the pain medication. This photo was taken before any of that. Before she knew, before any of us knew. She thought Heather was yours when she wrote that. Of course she did. Lily said she watched her father nod slowly, wanting to believe it. Wanting the narrative that made him the victim, the one who'd been betrayed, rather than the man who'd just destroyed his own daughter in front of a carefully assembled audience. But something had cracked. Lily could see it in his face. Margaret had moved closer, put her hand on his shoulder in that gesture of comfort she'd perfected over 3 decades. I know this is painful, Richard, but the DNA doesn't lie. This photo doesn't change what the test showed. Sarah wrote this before she knew about her infidelities. You can't torture yourself with what-ifs. He'd nodded again. Let Margaret take the photograph from his hands, watched her set it aside face down. Let her guide him upstairs. Let her put him to bed like he was the one who needed care, who needed protection from cruel reality. But Lily had gone to check on him later that night around 2 a.m. and found him awake in his study. The photograph was in his hands again. He was just staring at it, at his own younger face, at Sarah's handwriting from beyond the grave. I thought I heard him crying. Lily told me, her own voice breaking. Just sitting there in the dark, holding that picture, crying. Because the timeline didn't add up, did it? I was born 9 months after my parents married. If Sarah had been having an affair, when, with whom Margaret had always been vague on those details, always deflected when pressed. I don't like to speak ill of the dead. It's not my place to share ugly details. What matters is what the DNA showed, not the sordid specifics. And the DNA test itself, done at Margaret's suggestion, at a clinic where Margaret had connections, delivered by Margaret, interpreted by Margaret, used by Margaret to reshape an entire family's structure. My father had never questioned it, never demanded a second opinion, never investigated the clinic's credentials, never asked for the actual medical records beyond the single-page summary Margaret had provided. Why would he? Margaret was his wife. Margaret had no reason to lie. Margaret was trying to protect him from painful truth. Except questioning would have meant confronting a possibility too terrible to face, that he'd been unspeakably cruel to his own child for 14 years, based on a lie. That every cold dinner, every dismissive comment, every moment he'd chosen Lily over me, every time he'd made me feel like I wasn't enough, all of it would be his fault, his failing, his unforgivable cruelty. It was easier to trust Margaret, easier to believe the test, easier to be the victim of Sarah's supposed betrayal than the villain of his own story. Lily said he didn't sleep that night. She heard him pacing his study until dawn, heard him pick up the phone twice and put it down without calling anyone, heard him pull out files, papers, searching for something she couldn't see. "I think he's starting to doubt," Lily said to me on the phone, her voice small and scared. "I think your gift did something Mom didn't expect. I think it made him question everything." But I couldn't bring myself to care. Not then. The damage was done. He'd stood in front of 50 people and said I wasn't his daughter, that my mother had betrayed him, that I wasn't legitimate, wasn't worthy of being called a Brown. Whatever doubt that photograph had planted, it was 14 years too late. It was 37 years too late. The photo didn't change anything that night, but it planted a question that wouldn't die. For 2 weeks after that phone call with Lily, I barely functioned. I called in sick to work, citing a family emergency, which was technically true even if it grossly understated the situation. I ignored the dozen voicemails from Lily. I let mail pile up unopened. I ordered takeout and left the containers on the counter until they started to smell. I slept 12, 14, 16 hours a day, waking only when the weight of consciousness became unavoidable, then willing myself back into oblivion. I considered disappearing, just leaving, selling my apartment, quitting my job, moving somewhere no one had ever heard of the Brown family. Somewhere I could be just Heather, not the daughter who wasn't really a daughter, not the product of an affair, not the living reminder of betrayal. I researched cities where I had no connections, looked at job postings in Portland, Seattle, Austin, places I could start over with a clean slate. But something stopped me every time I got close to actually applying. Some stubborn part of me that refused to run, refused to accept what had been done to me without understanding why. And then the fog of shock began to lift, and underneath it was rage. Not the hot, explosive kind, the cold, clarifying kind, the kind that burns away everything else until all that's left is pure focus. 14 years. My father had known for 14 years that he supposedly wasn't my biological father. 14 years of coldness, of distance, of holding me to impossible standards while showering Lily with unconditional love. 14 years of making me feel like I wasn't enough, like something fundamental about me was wrong. And he'd never told me. Never sat me down and said, "Heather, I need to talk to you about something difficult." Never gave me a chance to defend myself, to question the evidence, to fight for my place in the family. He'd just withdrawn his love and let me spend 14 years trying to earn it back, knowing the entire time it would never come. That was the cruelty that finally broke through my numbness. Not the public disownment, as awful as that was, but the years of silent rejection, of letting me believe I was failing when the game had been rigged from the start. That night, lying awake at 3 a.m. for the 14th night in a row, I made a decision. I would find out the truth. The real truth, not the version my father had been fed, not the narrative Margaret had constructed. Even if the truth destroyed me, even if it confirmed that I really wasn't Richard's daughter and my mother really had betrayed him, I needed to know. Because living with the question, with the uncertainty, was worse than any answer could possibly be. The next morning, I called my father's lawyer. I need a copy of the DNA test that Richard referenced at the party, I said, keeping my voice professional and flat. The one that supposedly proves I'm not his daughter. There was a long pause. Ms. Brown, I don't think that's appropriate given the family circumstances. If he's going to publicly disown me in front of 50 people, I cut him off. I deserve to see the evidence he's using to justify it. Or do you think it's acceptable to destroy someone's life without even showing them why? Another pause. Then, reluctantly, I'll need to clear it with Richard. So I called my father directly. It was the first time I'd spoken to him since the party. His voice when he answered was hesitant, almost fearful. Heather. I want to see the DNA test, I said without preamble. The one you used to determine I'm not your daughter. I think I've earned the right to see the evidence. Silence. Then, Margaret said it would only upset you. Margaret doesn't get to decide what upsets me, I said, and I heard him flinch at the sharpness in my voice. I'm asking you as the man who raised me for 23 years before that test supposedly changed everything to give me the courtesy of seeing what convinced you I wasn't worth loving anymore. The guilt in that statement did its work. 2 days later, a manila envelope arrived in my mail. Inside was a photocopy of a single page. The moment I looked at it, my stomach dropped. Not because of what it said, but because of what it was. Or more accurately, what it wasn't. I'd worked in healthcare administration for 15 years. I'd seen hundreds of legitimate medical documents, including paternity test results. I knew what they were supposed to look like. Chain of custody documentation showing exactly when and how samples were collected by whom under what circumstances. Witness signatures, case numbers, accreditation certifications from the laboratory, detailed genetic marker analysis, signatures from board-certified geneticists with their credentials listed. This had none of that. The letterhead said Clearview Family Health Services, with an address in a neighboring town. The format was oddly informal, almost casual. No case number at the top, no witness signatures, just a brief typed paragraph. Sample A Heather Brown and Sample B Richard Brown do not share genetic markers consistent with biological paternity. Probability of paternity, 0%. Below that, a signature I couldn't read and no credentials listed for whoever had signed it. That was it. That was the evidence my father had used to emotionally exile me for 14 years. A single page that wouldn't have passed the most basic scrutiny from anyone who knew what legitimate paternity testing looked like. I sat at my kitchen table for an hour, just staring at it, feeling something shift in my chest. This wasn't grief anymore. This was something sharper, more dangerous. Someone had given my father this joke of a test, and he'd believed it without question. Or he'd wanted to believe it. Either way, my entire adult life had been shaped by a piece of paper that looked like it had been created specifically to appear legitimate to someone who didn't know better. I pulled out my laptop and started digging. Clearview Family Health Services. I found business filings showing it had operated for about 8 years before closing 12 years ago. Small operation, just a few staff members. The medical director was listed as Dr. Patricia Hammond. I searched for her, found she'd retired shortly after the clinic closed, now lived in Florida. Then I remembered something. When I'd been going through my grandmother's things after she died, I'd found old tax returns, family documents, random papers she'd saved. I'd taken a box of them, thinking maybe there'd be something about my mother. I dug through my storage closet until I found it. There, in tax returns from 20 to 25 years ago, was Margaret's employment history. And there it was, Margaret Brown, Office Manager, Clearview Family Health Services. She'd worked there for 3 years, ending about 15 years ago, just a year before the test was supposedly done. Margaret had worked at the clinic, had been the office manager, meaning she'd had access to everything: systems records, supplies, forms. She'd worked directly under Dr. Patricia Hammond. She'd have known exactly how to make something look official enough to convince someone who trusted her. The test claimed samples were collected and processed at Clearview, but there was nothing showing who collected them when under what circumstances. No documentation of Richard and me going to the clinic. No witness signatures saying, "I observed the collection of these samples." No chain of custody showing the samples had been handled properly, hadn't been switched or contaminated. For a test with such catastrophic consequences, a father disowning his daughter, the lack of proper documentation was staggering. Either my father had been spectacularly careless about something this important, or someone had given him a test designed to look just legitimate enough to convince a trusting man who wanted to believe it. I ordered a new test that afternoon. Gene Trust Laboratories, one of the most reputable DNA testing companies in the country, fully accredited, used by courts and immigration services. They sent me a kit. I did my own cheek swab, sealed it in the container they provided, kept it with me until I could mail it directly. Getting my father's DNA was trickier. I couldn't exactly ask him to provide a sample. But I remembered that when my grandmother's house was being cleared out, my father had taken some of his own father's belongings: old razors, a hairbrush, other personal items. I called the estate lawyer handling the distribution, said there was one item of my grandfather's I'd really like to have for sentimental value. He sent me a box of miscellaneous items Richard hadn't wanted. Inside were combs, a razor, a toothbrush. Things with my father's DNA on them from when he'd been sorting through grandfather's belongings. I packaged them carefully, included them with my sample, sent everything to Gene Trust with a request for full analysis. Results would take 3 to 4 weeks. 4 weeks of not knowing whether I'd been right to hope or whether the original test would be confirmed, and I'd have to accept that my entire existence really was the product of my mother's betrayal. 4 weeks of waiting to learn if the test that destroyed me was built on lies, and if someone was desperate to keep that buried. While waiting for the DNA results, I couldn't just sit idle for 4 weeks. I needed to understand how that first test had been created, who was involved, what the full extent of the deception was. So I started with Dr. Patricia Hammond, the medical director who'd signed off on the original test. Finding her wasn't difficult. A few internet searches revealed she'd retired to Florida 12 years ago, shortly after Clearview closed. I found a phone number listed under her name in Boca Raton. I called on a Tuesday afternoon, my hands shaking slightly as I dialed. She answered on the third ring. "Hello. Dr. Hammond. My name is Heather Brown. I'm calling about a paternity test that was performed at Clearview Family Health Services 14 years ago." The silence that followed was so complete I thought she'd hung up. Then her voice came back tight and strained. "I don't discuss former patients. I'm not asking you to break confidentiality. I'm the patient. It was my test. I just want to understand the procedures that were followed. I can't help you." Her voice had gone from tight to panicked. "I don't have those records anymore. The clinic closed years ago. I'm sorry I have to go. Please, just 5 minutes. I need to know if proper protocols were—" "I said I can't help you. Don't call this number again." Click. I sat staring at my phone, my heart pounding. That wasn't the response of someone who had nothing to hide. That was fear. Pure, unmistakable fear. Which meant there was something to be afraid of. Something to hide. 2 days later, Margaret called me. I saw her name on my caller ID and almost didn't answer. But something made me pick up. I needed to hear what she'd say now that I was digging into her past. "Heather, darling." Her voice was warm, concerned everything it had always been in public. "I heard you've been looking into that old DNA test. I understand you're hurt by what your father announced, but digging into painful past won't change the facts." I kept my voice flat, emotionless. "The facts based on evidence you provided to my father. You suggested the test. You chose the clinic. You delivered the results. I checked the employment records, Margaret. You worked at Clearview." There was a pause, just a beat too long. She hadn't expected me to dig that deep that quickly. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted, become more careful. "I never said I provided the test directly. You worked there. Dr. Hammond was your boss. The test conveniently happened right after you left that position. That's not suspicious to you." She shifted tactics smoothly, seamlessly. "Heather, I was trying to help your father find peace of mind. Your mother's affairs were an open secret in their social circle. People talked. Richard was the only one who didn't seem to know. The test just confirmed what everyone already suspected. What affairs? I pressed, feeling my anger rise. Who did she supposedly sleep with? Give me names. Give me dates. Give me actual evidence instead of vague accusations against a dead woman who can't defend herself. I don't traffic in ugly rumors, Heather. Her voice had taken on that wounded tone like I was being unreasonable. I'm simply telling you what I know. But I think you should let this go before you embarrass yourself further. These questions, this investigation, it's not going to change anything. It's only going to make you look desperate and vindictive. Then she hung up, just like that. But I heard what she hadn't said. Stop digging. Stop asking questions. Accept what you've been told, which only made me more determined to find the truth. A week later, I received an email from an address that was just a random string of letters and numbers. No subject line, just an attachment. I almost deleted it as spam, but something made me open it. Inside was a scanned document yellowed with age, formatted like a personal letter. The header read, "To whom it may concern," and was dated 6 years ago. The signature at the bottom was illegible, but the typed name beneath said, Robert Chen, Laboratory Technician. I read the letter 3 times, my heart sinking with each pass. It was a confession. The writer claimed to be a former lab technician at Clearview who'd accidentally mixed up samples during the processing of a paternity test. He expressed deep guilt and remorse, said fear of legal consequences had prevented him from coming forward earlier. He claimed the error had haunted him for years, that he needed to confess, even though the clinic had closed and he could no longer make amends. It looked perfect. The right tone of contrition. Technical details that sounded plausible. It explained everything the test was wrong, but not through malice, just through tragic human error. But something felt wrong about it. I read it again, paying attention to the language this time. The phrasing was stilted formal in a way that didn't sound like genuine guilt. It was how someone who'd never felt genuine remorse might imagine remorse would sound. Like an actor playing a part but not quite nailing the emotional authenticity. I checked the PDF metadata. File creation date 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago. This letter was supposedly written 6 years ago, but the file had been created 2 weeks ago, days after I'd started investigating, days after I'd called Dr. Hammond, days after Margaret and I had our tense conversation. Someone was watching my investigation, anticipating my moves, planting false evidence to send me down a dead end to make me think the wrong test was just an accident. Nothing sinister, nothing to investigate further. The letter was too convenient, too perfectly timed, too exactly what I'd need to see to stop asking questions. And whoever had created it had made a crucial mistake. They'd forgotten to backdate the file creation metadata. Margaret. It had to be Margaret. She was scared enough to manufacture evidence, which meant there was something real to hide, something worth the risk of creating fake documents. That same night I came home from the grocery store, I'd been gone maybe 20 minutes and found a note that had been slipped under my apartment door. Block print handwriting deliberately disguised, written on plain white paper with no distinguishing features. Let it go. You can't win against her. She's planned this too long. Some battles aren't worth fighting. Walk away while you still can. No signature. No specific threats. Just a warning that made every hair on my arm stand up. Who had written this? Someone who knew what Margaret had done and was trying to help me by warning me off. Or Margaret herself trying to frighten me into silence through anonymous intimidation. Either way, someone had been in my building at my door, knew where I lived, was watching me closely enough to know when I'd be gone. And the message itself revealed something crucial. This wasn't just about a faked DNA test from 14 years ago. This was bigger. Longer planned, deeper. Someone had been orchestrating my destruction for much longer than 14 years. The note said too long, meaning years, decades maybe. Why? What had I done to deserve this level of sustained, calculated cruelty? What had my mother done? Because this level of hatred didn't come from nowhere. This was personal. This was revenge for something, but I had no idea what. I was fighting a war I didn't understand against an enemy who'd been preparing since before I was born. The next 3 weeks were torture. Every day I checked my mail with a mixture of dread and desperate hope. I'd wake up at dawn, unable to sleep, and refresh the Gene Trust tracking information obsessively. Processing. Analysis in progress. Results pending. I'd prepared myself for the worst. Told myself that if the test confirmed Richard wasn't my biological father, at least I'd know. At least the cruelty would have been based on truth. At least there'd be a reason for 37 years of feeling unwanted. I could accept being unwanted if there was a logical explanation. If my mother really had betrayed my father, if I really was another man's child, then the coldness would make sense. Painful, but comprehensible. But I hadn't let myself hope for the alternative. Hope was too dangerous. Hope could destroy you more completely than any truth. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, 26 days after I'd sent the samples. White envelope, official looking, stamped with confidential genetic testing results in red letters across the front. My hands shook so badly I almost couldn't get it open. I had to set it on the kitchen counter and use a knife to slice through the seal because my fingers wouldn't cooperate. Inside was a folder with the Gene Trust logo, multiple pages of technical analysis that I'd read later. But the first page was a summary written in clear language designed for people without genetics degrees. I read the first line, then read it again, then again. The words wouldn't arrange themselves into meaning my brain could accept. Probability of paternity 99.98%. Richard Brown cannot be excluded as the biological father of Heather Brown. This result confirms biological paternity with scientific certainty. The numbers didn't change no matter how many times I read them. The conclusion remained absolute. Richard Brown was my biological father. Not possibly, not probably, conclusively, scientifically, undeniably. The genetic markers matched. The analysis was thorough, detailed, performed by a nationally accredited laboratory with impeccable reputation. I sat down on my kitchen floor, still holding the papers, and I cried. But not from joy, not from relief. From rage so pure and all-consuming, it felt like it would burn me alive from the inside out. 14 years. 14 years my father had believed I wasn't his daughter. 14 years of coldness, of distance, of holding me to impossible standards while showering Lily with unconditional love. 14 years of me trying desperately to earn back affection that had been stolen from me through deliberate lies. 14 years of thinking something was fundamentally wrong with me, that I was unlovable, that I deserved the rejection. And before that, 23 years of more subtle exclusion, of Margaret's careful manipulations of growing up feeling like I didn't quite belong without understanding why. 37 years. My entire life. Poisoned by a lie someone had deliberately, carefully, methodically constructed. I stayed on that floor for an hour, maybe 2, just sitting there holding papers that proved what should never have needed proving. That I belonged. That I was wanted. That my father's DNA ran through my veins just as surely as my mother's did. Someone had taken that away from me. Someone had looked at a 3-year-old child who'd just lost her mother and decided that child deserved to spend her entire life feeling unwanted. And someone had made my father complicit in that cruelty by feeding him lies he'd been too weak or too willing to believe. When I finally got up off the floor, I knew what my first instinct would tell me to do. Storm over to my father's house, throw these results in his face, demand acknowledgement, demand apology, demand that he fix this. Make this right. Give me back the childhood and adolescence and young adulthood that had been stolen from me. But I forced myself to stop. To think strategically instead of emotionally. Because Margaret had 14 years of reinforcement, 14 years of building layers of lies, 14 years of preparing explanations and counter-narratives. She was smart. She was patient. She was always 3 steps ahead. If I showed up with just this one test result, what would happen? Margaret would discredit it immediately. She'd claim I'd faked it, bribed the laboratory was desperately lying to get my hands on inheritance money. She'd spin this as vindictive manipulation from a bitter daughter who couldn't accept the truth. She'd double down on the story of my mother's supposed affairs, paint Sarah as a liar and me as her accomplice from beyond the grave. And my father, weak, conflict-averse, desperate to believe his wife over the daughter he'd already rejected, would choose to believe Margaret. Because the alternative was facing something unbearable that he'd psychologically abused his own child for 14 years based on lies. That every cold dinner, every dismissive comment, every moment he'd chosen Lily over me, every time he'd made me feel inadequate and unworthy, all of it had been based on fraud. All of it had been his fault. People will believe almost anything to avoid facing that level of guilt. My father would choose Margaret's lies over my truth because Margaret's lies let him be a victim. My truth made him a villain in his own story, and people will do almost anything to avoid being the villain. So scientific proof of paternity wasn't enough. I needed more. I needed to understand why this had been done to me. I needed to expose not just the lie, but the motivation behind it, the full scope of the deception. I needed to make this so undeniable, so public, so thoroughly documented that there would be no room for Margaret to spin it, no escape route for my father to take. This wasn't about proving I was Richard's daughter anymore. That was established fact, scientific certainty no longer in question. The fight ahead was about proving that Margaret had deliberately, knowingly, maliciously created false evidence to destroy the relationship between a father and his daughter. And that required understanding her motivation. What drives someone to invest decades, not months, not years, but actual decades in systematically dismantling a child's sense of worth? What had my mother Sarah done, or what did I represent, that warranted this level of sustained, calculated psychological warfare? This felt personal in a way that went beyond inheritance or greed. Margaret's children would benefit from my exclusion. Yes, but this level of elaborate deception seemed disproportionate to simple financial gain. You don't spend 37 years destroying someone just for money. You do it for revenge. For hatred so deep it becomes the organizing principle of your entire life. But revenge for what Sarah had supposedly been Margaret's best friend. What could have happened to turn friendship into this kind of methodical cruelty? I thought about Margaret's reaction when I'd found that single photograph of my mother. The flash of something that looked like rage toward a woman who'd been dead for 3 decades. That wasn't the grief of losing a friend. That was active, present hatred. You don't hate someone that intensely, that persistently, without a reason that goes soul deep. I needed to understand that reason. I needed to know the whole truth, not just the genetic truth. Because without understanding the why, I couldn't prove the deliberate malice. I couldn't expose Margaret in a way that would make my father finally see what had been done to both of us. I called Marcus Chen the next morning. He was a private investigator a colleague had recommended years ago for an employment verification issue. His reputation was solid, thorough, discreet, expensive, and worth every penny. "I need you to investigate someone," I told him. "My stepmother. I need to know everything about her. Her past, her relationship with my late mother, what happened before I was born. Everything." "How far back are we going?" 40 years if you need to. However far it takes to understand why she spent my entire life destroying me. I took a leave of absence from work, used vacation time first, then unpaid leave when that ran out. I liquidated my savings account, put everything I had into finding the truth, because what was money compared to understanding why you'd been tortured for 37 years? I had proof I belonged, but proof alone wouldn't be enough to break 14 years of lies. I went silent. Completely, deliberately silent. Margaret called 6 times in the first week after I got the DNA results. I didn't answer. She left voicemails that progressed from concerned to confused to subtly threatening. "Heather, darling, please call me back. Your father is worried. We just want to make sure you're all right. It's not healthy to isolate yourself like this." Richard sent one email forwarded through his lawyer which told me everything I needed to know about his cowardice. He couldn't even contact me directly. The email was brief and uncomfortable. Heather, Margaret tells me you've been asking questions about the past. I hope you understand that what happened at the party was difficult for everyone. Perhaps we could talk when emotions aren't so raw. I deleted it without responding. I'd learned my lesson at the birthday party. Acting on emotion, confronting without complete information, showing your hand before you understood the full game. All of that gave your opponents time to counter, to spin, to control the narrative. Margaret had decades of practice at controlling narratives. I wasn't going to give her another opportunity. So I let them think I'd given up. Let them believe the public humiliation had worked, that I'd slunk away to lick my wounds in defeated silence. Let them relax, get comfortable, assume the war was over, and they'd won. Meanwhile, I prepared for the real battle. Marcus Chen came highly recommended. Mid-40s former FBI analyst, now running his own investigative firm specializing in background checks and fraud cases. His rates were astronomical, but his reputation was better. When I met him at his office, I put the DNA results on his desk along with everything I'd found about the fake test. I need to know everything about Margaret Webb Brown, I said. Before she married my father, before she came into our lives. Her relationship with my mother, Sarah. Why she spent 37 years destroying me. I need the truth, the whole truth, no matter how ugly it is. He looked at the documents, then at me. How far back? However far it takes. 40 years if necessary. I have money, not unlimited, but enough. And if what I find is something you don't want to know, then I need to know it even more. 3 weeks later, Marcus called me to his office. The folder he handed me was thin, but the expression on his face told me it contained something significant. Your stepmother, he said carefully, has been very careful about her past, but I found some things. The first thing that jumped out at me was high school yearbook photos. Margaret Webb and Sarah Taylor, sophomore year, standing together in drama club photos on the prom committee. They looked friendly, not best friends exactly, but connected. Then junior year, nothing. They appeared in completely separate social circles. No photos together, no overlap. Something had happened between sophomore and junior year that drove them apart. They knew each other in high school, Marcus said. But calling them lifelong best friends? That's fiction. They had some kind of falling out junior year. None of the people I contacted remembered exactly what happened, but several mentioned there was drama involving a boy. College records were even more revealing. Sarah had attended State University in state. Margaret had gone to a small private college 3 states away. They couldn't have been roommates. Couldn't have maintained a close friendship through college years when they were hundreds of miles apart with no documented contact. The best friend since college story Margaret had told for 34 years was a complete lie. So consistent, so confidently told that everyone, including me, had simply accepted it as truth. Why question it? What reason would Margaret have to lie about being friends with my dead mother? Then Marcus showed me the document that made my hands go numb. It was a death notice from a small-town newspaper, yellowed and scanned from microfilm dated 38 years ago. The text was brief, formal. Baby Emma Brown, born sleeping beloved daughter of Margaret Webb and Richard Brown. Services private. In lieu of flowers, donations may be made to March of Dimes. I read it 3 times before the words made sense. Margaret and Richard. A baby. 38 years ago. Your father and Margaret had a child together, Marcus said quietly, before he married your mother. The baby was stillborn at 28 weeks. I found hospital records. Emma Rose Brown. Margaret was 24. Your father was 26. I sat there holding this piece of paper that recontextualized my entire existence. My father and Margaret had been together, had lost a child, and then somehow my father had ended up with Sarah instead. I started pulling together a timeline from everything Marcus had found, everything I knew. Emma died 38 years ago in March. 9 months later in December, Richard married Sarah. The wedding announcement was small, rushed, almost apologetic in tone. 3 months after that wedding in March, exactly 1 year after Emma's death, I was born. which meant Sarah had been pregnant when she married my father. Had been pregnant during Margaret's grieving period. Had taken Richard and started a new life while Margaret was still mourning the baby she'd lost. Had Sarah deliberately pursued Richard while Margaret was grieving? Was that what the high school falling out had been about, both of them interested in the same man? Had Sarah waited, watched, and swooped in the moment Margaret was most vulnerable? The revenge made terrible, cruel sense now. In Margaret's mind, Sarah hadn't just taken the man Margaret loved. She'd taken him while Margaret was destroyed by grief, while Margaret was mourning the death of her daughter. And then Sarah had gotten pregnant, had gotten to give Richard a living child, while Margaret's child lay in the ground. "There's more," Marcus said. "The grave." That's how I found myself 2 hours outside the city, walking through a small cemetery on a gray Thursday afternoon, searching for a headstone I'd never known existed. It took me 20 minutes to find it. The Brown family plot was in an older section, and Emma's stone was tiny compared to the others, weathered by 38 years of weather moss growing in the carved letters. Emma Rose Brown, born sleeping into the arms of angels, forever our beloved daughter. The dates confirmed everything. Emma would have been 38 years old, my exact age. If she'd lived, we would have been the same age, possibly even in the same grade in school. Someone had left flowers, wilted roses, maybe a week old, the only sign that anyone still remembered this tiny grave existed. Margaret, I realized. Margaret still came here, still mourned, still felt the loss as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. I sat down on the grass next to Emma's grave and finally understood. I wasn't Margaret's target because of who I was. I was targeted because of what I represented. I was the daughter who got to live while Emma died. I was Sarah's daughter, born from Sarah's theft of Margaret's life. Every time Margaret looked at me, she saw the child her enemy got to raise while Emma's grave lay empty and forgotten. This wasn't about money. This wasn't about inheritance. This was about a mother who'd never healed from losing her child, who'd turned that grief into a weapon, who'd spent 37 years making me feel as unwanted, as erased, as unmourned as Emma had been. Margaret hadn't just wanted revenge. She'd wanted me to feel exactly what she felt. And she'd succeeded. I wasn't Margaret's target because of who I was, but because of who I represented. Understanding that Emma existed didn't give me the full picture. I needed to know what had happened 38 years ago. How had my father gone from being engaged to Margaret expecting a baby to marrying Sarah just 9 months after that baby died? What had happened at that family gathering where Emma was lost? Marcus had given me a list of family members who'd been alive during that time. Most were dead now. The few still living had refused to talk to him, citing family loyalty or faded memory. But there was one name at the bottom of the list with a note, Edward Brown Richard's uncle, 82 Shady Oaks Nursing Home, willing to talk if approached directly. I drove out to the nursing home on a Saturday morning. Edward Brown was in the common room sitting by a window with a crossword puzzle he wasn't actually working on. When I introduced myself, his face went through several expressions: surprise, recognition, something that looked like guilt. "You look like her," he said. "Like Sarah. Same eyes. I wondered if you'd ever come asking questions." I sat down across from him. No one else will talk to me about what happened. About Emma, about how my mother ended up with my father. I need to understand. He was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at nothing. Then he started talking, and I realized he'd been waiting years for someone to ask someone to finally hear the truth that the family had buried. Margaret and Richard were engaged, he said, his voice thin but clear. This was 38 years ago. She was 7 months pregnant. They'd picked out the name Emma Rose, already had a crib set up, had the wedding planned for after the baby came. Margaret was excited. Richard was excited. Everyone thought they'd be happy. He paused, and I could see him gathering courage for the next part. There was a family gathering at your grandparents' house, 4th of July weekend. Big party, lots of people. I was there. I saw what happened, but I still don't fully understand it. He closed his eyes like the memory hurt. Margaret and Sarah were at the top of the stairs. Sarah had come home from college for the holiday. They were arguing about something. Their voices were raised, but I couldn't hear the words from where I was standing. My heart was pounding. What happened? Margaret fell, tumbled down a full flight of stairs. She was 7 months pregnant and she fell. Some people said she slipped, lost her balance. Some said Sarah pushed her. Sarah said she'd reached out to steady Margaret and Margaret had pulled away. Margaret said Sarah deliberately pushed her. The family was divided. Everyone saw something different or thought they did or wanted to believe they did. And Emma? Margaret went into labor that night. Premature, 28 weeks. The baby didn't survive. Born too small, too early. They tried everything, but... He trailed off, shaking his head. Margaret was in the hospital for weeks. Physically she healed, but mentally she was destroyed, completely broken. She kept saying Sarah had killed her baby, kept saying it over and over. I felt sick. And my mother. Sarah was there too during Margaret's recovery. Came to the hospital a few times crying, saying it was an accident, begging Margaret to believe her. But Margaret wouldn't even look at her. Then Sarah stopped coming, and she started spending time with Richard instead. While Margaret was in the hospital. Yes, his face held shame. While Margaret was still hospitalized, still grieving, Sarah became Richard's comfort. She'd always had feelings for him, everyone knew that. She'd been jealous when he chose Margaret. And now she saw her chance. Within a month of Emma's death, Richard and Sarah had slept together. Sarah got pregnant. The timeline was even worse than I'd imagined. Sarah had gotten pregnant with me while Margaret was still physically recovering from losing Emma. The family was horrified, Edward continued. Not at Margaret for losing the baby, but at Richard and Sarah for what they did. It felt like a betrayal of Emma's memory. But Sarah was pregnant and the family pressured Richard to do the right thing. Marry her. Give the baby a name. So he did. What happened to Margaret? She left. Disappeared completely. We heard she'd moved to another state, was trying to rebuild her life. We all thought she'd moved on. Found peace somehow. Got therapy, got help, found a way to heal from losing Emma and losing Richard. He looked at me with eyes full of regret. We were wrong. She never moved on. She never healed. She just waited. I asked Marcus to get me the police report from that night. It took 2 weeks and some creative public records requests, but he found it. Yellowed, barely legible in places, but still archived in a dusty file room in the county courthouse. The report was brief and inconclusive. Margaret Webb, 24, suffered fall at family residence resulting in premature labor and stillbirth. Victim claims she was pushed. Alleged perpetrator denies wrongdoing. Witness statements conflict. No physical evidence of assault. Investigation concludes insufficient evidence to determine if fall was accidental or result of assault. Case closed. I read the witness statements such as they were. Sarah Taylor, age 22. I reached out to steady her because she looked unbalanced. She pulled away from me and fell. It was an accident. I would never hurt her. Margaret Webb, age 24. She pushed me. I felt her hands on my back. She pushed me deliberately and my baby died because of what she did. Other witnesses gave vaguer accounts. They were arguing. It happened so fast. I didn't see exactly what happened. Unclear if she was pushed or fell. The truth was unknowable now. Everyone involved was dead except Richard and Margaret, and both had spent 38 years telling themselves whatever version they needed to believe. Did Sarah really push Margaret? Or did Margaret slip and in her grief needed someone to blame? Did Sarah deliberately kill Emma? Or did she make a terrible mistake reaching out at the wrong moment? It didn't matter. Not really. What mattered was what Margaret believed. For 38 years, Margaret had believed that Sarah murdered her daughter and then stole her life. And she'd spent those 38 years planning revenge. The timeline of Margaret's plan became clear once I understood her motivation. She'd waited until Sarah died to return. swooped in as the helpful friend while my father was vulnerable, made herself indispensable, married him within a year, given birth to Lily 3 years later, creating a replacement golden child. Systematically erased Sarah from family history, isolated me from my father through decades of subtle manipulation, created the false DNA test when I was 23, old enough to understand rejection, old enough to remember the pain, maintained that cold distance for 14 years, and finally the public disownment at my father's 65th birthday. 37 years. My entire lifetime. Every moment of my childhood, every interaction, every time Margaret hugged me or praised me or smiled at me in public, all of it had been part of this plan. She'd raised me the daughter of her enemy while secretly poisoning my relationship with my father, all building toward this final moment of complete destruction. The patience was terrifying. The hatred must have been bottomless to sustain this for so long. And the symbolism was deliberate, calculated. Sarah took Emma's place in Richard's life, so Margaret would erase my place in the family. Sarah got to raise a daughter while Margaret mourned, so Margaret would make sure I felt unloved every day of my life. Sarah stole Richard's love so Margaret would make Richard reject his own child. And the timing, the public disownment on Richard's 65th birthday, exactly 37 years after Emma's death. I'd lived the exact span of time Emma never got to live. Margaret had waited my entire lifetime to execute this revenge. I was never Heather to her. I was the daughter who lived when hers didn't. I thought I had enough. The new DNA test proving conclusively that Richard was my biological father. The documented irregularities in the fake test, no chain of custody, no proper documentation created at a clinic where Margaret had worked. Emma's death and the timeline showing clear revenge motive. 37 years of calculated destruction culminating in my public humiliation. I took it all to an attorney who specialized in estate fraud. She spent 2 hours reviewing every document, every piece of evidence, every connection I'd drawn. When she finished, she looked at me with something like awe. "This is one of the clearest cases of fraud I've ever seen," she said. "The fake DNA test alone is enough for criminal charges. Add in the elder abuse angle, manipulating your father at 65 into disinheriting his biological daughter, and you have grounds for serious legal action. This is an exceptionally strong case." I felt vindicated. Finally. Someone with legal expertise confirming what I knew: Margaret had committed fraud and I had proof. I arranged a formal meeting through the attorney. Not a casual family dinner where emotions could derail everything, but a proper legal meeting with witnesses. Richard, Margaret, Lily, my attorney, and 2 of Richard's cousins who'd agreed to serve as neutral observers. We met in a conference room at the law office, everything official and documented. I walked in prepared. I had binders of evidence, timeline charts, the DNA results in their official folder. I'd rehearsed what I'd say. I felt certain that once everyone saw the evidence laid out clearly, logically, indisputably, the truth would be impossible to deny. I presented everything methodically. First, the new DNA test from Gene Trust Laboratories, fully accredited, showing 99.98% probability that Richard was my biological father. I passed copies around the table. Scientific certainty. Undeniable. Then the original test with all its glaring irregularities. No case number. No proper chain of custody. Created at a clinic where Margaret had been office manager, where she'd had access to Form's equipment records. I showed them Margaret's employment history, the dates that proved she'd worked there until just a year before the test was supposedly done. Finally, Emma's death. The obituary, the timeline. Margaret losing her daughter, then my mother getting pregnant with me while Margaret was still grieving. The revenge motive spanning 37 years. Every piece of my childhood recontextualized as part of Margaret's long game. The room was silent as I finished. Richard had gone pale, one hand pressed to his chest like he couldn't breathe. Lily's face was horror-stricken, tears already forming. The witnesses looked stunned, like they'd walked into something far bigger than they'd expected. My attorney sat quietly watching Margaret. Margaret was very still. Her face showed shock, pain, confusion, all the right emotions for someone whose secret had been exposed. Then she spoke, and her voice was shaking. "Yes," she said. "I did create that false test, and I've regretted it every single day since." She dabbed at her eyes, and I couldn't tell if the tears were real or performed. When Sarah was dying, when the cancer had spread, and she was on so much pain medication she barely knew where she was, she told me something, a confession. She said she'd had an affair early in her marriage to Richard. She said she wasn't certain Heather was Richard's child. I started to object, but my attorney put a hand on my arm. "Let her talk," the gesture said. "Let her incriminate herself." Sarah was terrified. Margaret continued, her voice breaking. "She begged me not to tell Richard. She didn't want Heather to grow up without a father, didn't want to destroy the family. She made me promise to keep her secret." But after Sarah died, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Should I honor my dying friend's confession? Or should I protect Richard from unknowingly raising another man's child? I was grieving. Sarah still grieving Emma, and I wasn't thinking clearly. I thought I was protecting Richard, so I arranged the test privately. And when it came back saying Heather wasn't his, I told him. She looked at Richard with such genuine seeming remorse that I felt my certainty waver. It wasn't revenge. It was terrible grief-stricken judgment. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting you. Half the room believed her. I could see it in their faces. The tears looked real. The explanation was plausible. Richard's cousins were nodding slightly like it made sense. Even Richard looked confused, torn, wanting desperately to believe his wife wasn't a monster. "Margaret," he said slowly, "you should have told me the truth about this sooner. But I understand you were trying to protect everyone." Lily reached over and squeezed Margaret's hand. "Mom, this is awful, but I understand why you did it. You were protecting Dad." Only my attorney looked skeptical, but legal skepticism wasn't proof of malice. Margaret had acknowledged just enough truth to seem honest while completely reframing her intent. She'd turned deliberate fraud into tragic mistake, turned calculated destruction into misguided protection. She'd made herself the victim of impossible circumstances rather than the architect of 37 years of cruelty. The new DNA test proving I was Richard's daughter, the evidence I'd thought was conclusive, became secondary to Margaret's narrative. People wanted to believe in complicated grief and honest mistakes. They didn't want to believe in calculated evil spanning decades. After the meeting ended, I sat in my car in the parking garage, hands shaking. I'd brought facts, science, documentation. Margaret had brought a story people wanted to believe. I'd brought proof of fraud. She'd turned it into proof of love gone wrong. I'd been playing chess. Margaret had been playing a different game entirely. I'd brought truth to a liar's battlefield, and she'd turned my weapon into her shield. 3 days of silence after that disastrous meeting. 3 days of me sitting in my apartment, replaying Margaret's performance, watching her turn my evidence into her redemption story, feeling the certainty slip away. I'd been so sure that truth would be enough. I'd been naive. Then Lily called. Her voice was strange, hollow. "There's something you need to see. Can we meet, not anywhere near the house? Somewhere private." We met at a coffee shop 30 minutes outside the city, the kind of generic chain where no one would recognize us. Lily looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes were swollen, makeup couldn't hide the evidence of crying. She sat down across from me and immediately slid a folder across the table. "I found these," she said. "In Dad's safe. I have the combination because I'm listed as executor of his estate. I was looking for his life insurance policy for something, and I found this folder buried underneath everything else." I opened it. The first document was correspondence on law firm letterhead, dated 12 years ago. Subject line: confidential inquiry, legal obligations to non-biological children raised as own. My hands went numb. The letter was from Richard to a family law attorney. Brief clinical. "If it were determined that a child I've raised is not biologically mine, what are my legal obligations? Can I disinherit this child? What are the potential consequences?" The attorney's response was equally clinical, but clear. In most states, once you've acknowledged paternity and acted as a parent for years, you have ongoing legal and moral obligations regardless of biological relationship. A child you've raised for over 2 decades would have strong grounds to challenge any attempt at disinheritance. I would advise against this course of action without compelling reasons and proper legal documentation. 12 years ago. Richard had been consulting lawyers about removing me from his life 12 years ago. I was 25 then. An adult, yes, but still his daughter. Still hoping somewhere deep down that he'd eventually show me the warmth he'd always given Lily. "There's more," Lily said quietly. The next documents were photocopies of journal entries, Richard's handwriting unmistakable, dated from the same period continuing for several years. The first entry 13 years ago. M showed me the DNA test today. Says Heather isn't mine. Part of me can't believe it. She has my mother's eyes, my stubbornness, even my sense of humor. But if it's true, it would explain the distance I've always felt. Maybe I sensed it all along. Maybe that's why I could never bond with her the way I did with Lily. I read that line 3 times. Maybe that's why I could never bond with her. He was already making excuses, already using the lie to justify his own failures. 6 months later. Should probably get a second test. Independent lab, proper documentation. But what if it confirms what M's test showed? At least now I have an explanation that doesn't make me look like a terrible father. If she's not mine, the coldness was justified. Easier to believe the test than examine my own failures. A year after that, I find myself treating H differently now. Everything she does irritates me. Is it because I know she's not mine, or because I'm looking for reasons to justify how I already felt? Don't want to think about that too hard. I put the papers down. Couldn't look at them anymore. My father had doubted the test, had considered getting a second opinion, had written in his own hand that he wondered if the test was just giving him permission to do what he'd wanted to do, anyway reject me. He chose it, I said, my voice flat. Margaret gave him the lie, but he chose to believe it because it was convenient. Lily was crying again. "I'm so sorry, Heather. I benefited from all of this. Mom built me up by systematically destroying you, and I accepted it. I thought Dad loved me more because I was easier to love, better behaved, more what he wanted in a daughter. I didn't realize the whole thing was manufactured." She pushed the folder toward me. "This is yours. Do whatever you need to do with it. I can't defend him anymore. He had chances, so many chances to question the test, to demand proof, to fight for you. He chose not to because the lie was easier than the truth." I took the folder, feeling something shift inside me. For months, I'd focused all my rage on Margaret. She was the architect, the villain, the one who'd orchestrated everything. And she was guilty, no question. But Richard was guilty too. He'd had doubts. He'd written them down in his own hand. And he'd chosen not to investigate because if I wasn't his daughter, then his coldness wasn't cruelty. It was justified, reasonable, not his fault. Margaret had given him an excuse to stop loving me, but he'd wanted that excuse, had been looking for it maybe for years before she provided it. "He's a coward," I said. Lily nodded miserably. "Yes." Margaret gave him the lie, but he chose to live it. Learning about my father's complicity changed everything. I'd spent months building a case against Margaret, gathering evidence, preparing to expose her. But the family meeting had shown me that evidence wasn't enough when Margaret could spin any truth into a sympathetic narrative. And now, knowing that Richard had chosen to believe the lie because it absolved him of guilt, I understood that appealing to his sense of justice or parental love was pointless. He'd proven he had neither. I needed a different strategy. Margaret was too skilled at narrative control, too prepared with counter-stories. She'd admitted to creating the fake test and somehow made herself look like a tragic figure trying to protect everyone. I couldn't beat her at her own game by playing it her way. So I stopped trying to convince anyone of anything. Instead, I decided to plant doubt the way Margaret had planted doubt in my father's mind for decades. Slow, persistent, erosive. Not demanding he believe me, but making him question whether he could still believe Margaret. I would make him doubt her the way she'd made him doubt me. I spent a week carefully selecting what to send him. Not everything I knew that would be overwhelming, easy to dismiss. Just specific pieces that would create questions he couldn't ignore. I had copies made of Emma's obituary, the hospital records showing she'd been stillborn at 28 weeks. I created a simple timeline showing that Sarah had gotten pregnant with me 1 month after Emma's death, that I'd been born exactly 1 year after Emma died. I included documentation showing that Margaret had returned to the Brown family 1 week after Sarah's death, not months later as she'd always claimed. And at the bottom, on plain white paper with no signature, I typed a single question. Did Sarah steal your first child's life, or did someone steal your second daughter's identity? I mailed it to his office, not the house. Margaret monitored everything that came to the house, I was certain, but his office mail came directly to him. He'd see it first. He'd have to process it alone before Margaret had a chance to spin it. Then I waited. Lily called me 4 days later. "Something's happening," she said. "Dad and Mom had a huge fight last night. I heard them through the walls. Dad was asking her questions about Emma, about the timeline, about when she came back after your mom died. I've never heard him question her like that." What did Margaret say? I couldn't hear everything. But her voice was different. Not the calm, reasonable voice she usually uses. She sounded angry. Really angry. 2 days after that, Lily called again. He confronted her directly. I was in the kitchen, they were in the study, but the door was open. Dad asked her point blank, "Were you planning this? The DNA test turning me against Heather, was it really about protecting me? Or was it about punishing Sarah through her daughter?" What did she say? That's the thing. There was this pause. Just a few seconds, but it felt like forever. And when she finally answered, her voice was all wrong. She tried to sound hurt, said, "How can you ask me that after everything I've done for this family?" But Heather, for just a moment before she answered her face, I saw her face through the doorway. She looked furious. Not hurt. Not sad. Just this cold, pure rage. Did Dad see it? I think so, because he didn't apologize like he usually does when she gets upset. He just went quiet and left the room. That flash of rage was the crack I'd been waiting for. Margaret had controlled her image so perfectly for so long that everyone believed the mask was her real face. But stress makes people careless. Pressure reveals what's underneath the performance. I'd cracked her perfect facade, and a cornered enemy is the most dangerous kind. Lily's transformation didn't happen overnight. Looking back now, I can trace the exact progression of how she went from defending Margaret fiercely to becoming my reluctant ally. But at the time, each stage felt painfully slow. The first time I tried to show Lily the evidence, this was weeks ago, before the disastrous family meeting, she'd reacted with almost violent defensiveness. We'd met at a restaurant and I'd brought copies of everything I'd found. The fake DNA test, irregularities, Emma's obituary, the timeline showing Margaret's calculated integration into our family. Lily didn't even look at most of it. "You're trying to destroy our family," she'd said, her voice shaking with anger. "Mom made a mistake trying to protect Dad from your mother's affairs, but you're making her out to be some kind of monster when she was just trying to help." I tried to explain. She wouldn't listen. "You've always been jealous of me," she said, standing up, preparing to leave. "Now you're trying to steal my inheritance by inventing this elaborate conspiracy theory. It's pathetic, Heather. It's desperate. Don't contact me again with these lies." She'd walked out. I'd sat there with my folders of evidence, feeling like I'd failed before I'd even started. But I'd planted seeds. Whether Lily acknowledged it or not, questions had been raised that she couldn't completely ignore. Over the following weeks, Lily started noticing things. She told me this later after everything changed. Small details she'd overlooked her entire life suddenly felt significant. The way Margaret steered every conversation away from the past. The way she bristled whenever anyone mentioned Sarah positively. How Margaret had always carefully positioned Lily as the replacement for Heather in the family hierarchy, not just as another daughter, but as the right daughter, the real daughter. Lily began investigating on her own without telling Margaret. She went through old financial records stored in the basement documents Margaret probably thought no one would ever look at. She found bank statements showing payments to Clearview Health Services payments made the exact month before the DNA test was supposedly done. She found emails between Margaret and a lawyer discussing estate planning contingencies if the paternity question arises. Emails dated 15 years ago before the test even existed. And then she found the notes. Margaret's handwriting on a legal pad, probably from years ago, outlining phases like a military operation. Phase 1. Establish trust. Phase 2. Plant doubts. Phase 3. DNA confirmation. Phase 4. Gradual alienation. Phase 5. Public disinheritance. It was all real, all documented, all deliberate. Lily said she felt physically sick reading those notes. Every hug from Margaret, every "I'm so proud of you." Every time Margaret had praised her while subtly criticizing me, all of it had been strategy. All of it had been weapons in a war Lily hadn't known she was fighting. She confronted Margaret one night after Richard had gone to bed. I wasn't there, but Lily told me about it later, her voice hollow with shock. "Did you do this?" Lily had asked, showing Margaret the files she'd found. All of it was my entire childhood part of destroying Heather. Margaret's response contained no apology, no regret, no shame. "I did it for you, for us. Sarah took everything from me, my daughter, my life, my future with Richard. When she died, I had a choice: let her daughter have the life my Emma should have had or take it back. I chose justice. I chose you. Everything I did was so you would have what should have been Emma's, the father's love, the inheritance, the family position. Don't you dare judge me for giving you everything." Lily said that's when she realized Margaret wasn't conflicted about what she'd done. She was proud of it. She believed completely that decades of psychological abuse had been righteous vengeance. "You used me," Lily had whispered. "You made me the weapon against my own sister." Margaret's face had gone hard. "You were never sisters. She's Sarah's daughter. You're mine. Don't confuse biology with family." The next day, Lily called and asked to meet. We chose a coffee shop neither of us had been to before neutral territory. She brought a thick folder and slid it across the table to me. "This is everything I found," she said. "Financial records, emails, Margaret's planning notes. It proves she planned all of it." I looked at my half-sister. "Why are you doing this?" "Because it was wrong." Tears filled her eyes. "Because if I don't help you, I'm complicit. Because I can't live knowing my entire life was built on destroying yours." She paused, then continued, and I respected her for the honesty. "I can't undo your childhood, Heather. I can't give back what she took, but I can help you get justice. And then I need to walk away from all of this. From her, from Dad, maybe from you too. We can't be sisters. Not really. There's too much pain, too much damage. We're just two people who got used by the same woman." I took the folder. I understood. This wasn't about reconciliation or building a relationship. This was about doing what was right, even when it cost everything. My sister chose truth over comfort, but the cost was everything she'd believed about her own life. With Lily's evidence in my hands, financial records, emails, Margaret's handwritten planning notes outlining phases of destruction, I had everything I needed to go to the authorities immediately. My attorney said as much when I showed her the new materials. "This is prosecutable fraud. We could file criminal complaints today." But I didn't. Instead, I made a decision that went against every instinct screaming at me to act, to strike while I had momentum. I decided to retreat. I decided to, completely, strategically. I needed Margaret overconfident, not cornered. Desperate people are careful, paranoid, defensive. They cover tracks and prepare for attacks. But arrogant people who believe they've won make mistakes. They relax. They get sloppy. And I needed Margaret sloppy. So I went silent. Stopped all contact with everyone in the family. Didn't respond to the few texts Lily sent checking on me. Didn't send any more packages to Richard. Didn't push for meetings or confrontations. Just disappeared from their narrative entirely. Let Margaret think the combination of the failed family meeting and my father's obvious complicity had finally broken me. Let her believe I'd slunk away to nurse my wounds in defeated silence. Meanwhile, I met with my attorney 3 times a week. We organized every piece of evidence chronologically, built timelines, prepared witness lists, documented everything in formats that would hold up in court, found experts who could testify about DNA testing procedures and what legitimate results should look like, contacted forensic accountants to trace the money Margaret had paid to Clearview Health Services. Margaret thought I'd retreated in defeat. I'd actually just moved to higher, more defensible ground. And then I waited for Margaret to make mistakes. She didn't disappoint. Lily kept me informed even as she was planning her own exit from the family. "Mom's different lately," she told me in a hushed phone call. "More relaxed. She's saying things she used to be careful about." Margaret updated her will. Lily saw the revised document on Margaret's desk. The language was vindictive, unmistakably cruel. "I leave nothing to Heather Brown, who has caused this family immeasurable pain through her baseless accusations and manipulative attempts to destroy my marriage." No lawyer advising on estate planning would recommend that kind of language. It was pure spite put in writing documented proof of malice. Margaret started talking more freely at the country club. Lily heard from a friend who'd overheard, "Poor Richard is dealing with such a difficult situation. His ex-wife's daughter has always been troubled, and now she's making these wild accusations trying to get money. It's heartbreaking to watch." Not careful neutral phrasing. Outright contempt. Accusations of mental instability. All said to friends who might later be called as witnesses. Margaret emailed her attorney, the same one who'd been at the family meeting, with questions about ensuring Heather Brown has no legal recourse to contest estate distributions after Richard passes. Language that revealed planning premeditation, intent to permanently exclude me. My investigator, who I'd kept on retainer despite my apparent retreat, documented everything. Every unguarded statement, every email, every conversation Margaret thought was private. She'd gotten so confident in her victory that she'd stopped being careful. While Margaret relaxed, Richard fell apart. Lily described watching him deteriorate over those 2 months. His health suffered dramatically. Stress-induced hypertension that required medication. Chest pains that sent him to the emergency room twice. His doctor apparently warned him directly about heart attack risk, told him he needed to reduce stress, or he was heading for a major cardiac event. He started drinking heavily every evening. Lily could hear him pacing the house at night, unable to sleep. He lost weight, looked gaunt and aged. The doubt I'd planted had grown roots, and it was eating him alive. Part of him still wanted to believe Margaret. Wanted to believe her story about trying to protect him, about Sarah's deathbed confession, about tragic mistakes made from love. Because the alternative was unbearable, that he'd destroyed his own daughter, based on lies that he'd been too cowardly to question convenient evidence. Margaret watched his deterioration and saw it as vindication. "Look what Heather's accusations have done to your father," she told Lily. "He can't handle the stress of her lies." She didn't realize Richard wasn't stressed by my accusations. He was being destroyed by guilt. And guilt meant somewhere deep down, he was starting to believe me. After 2 months of complete silence, I sent Richard one final email. Brief, defeated sounding, "I'm done fighting for a place in a family that never wanted me. You made your choice. I hope it brings you peace." Lily told me later that Richard showed it to Margaret, immediately his relief visible. "She's giving up, thank God. I can't take much more of this." Margaret smiled. Actually smiled, Lily said. Genuine satisfaction. She'd finally completely broken me. Achieved the total erasure she'd been planning for 37 years. What neither of them knew, I'd filed the lawsuit 3 days before sending that email. Comprehensive civil complaint, alleging fraud conspiracy, intentional infliction of emotional distress, elder abuse. 40 pages of allegations backed by hundreds of pages of exhibits. My attorney had also contacted the state attorney general's office flagging potential criminal violations. The sheriff would serve papers in 4 days. The legal machinery was already in motion, unstoppable, while Margaret celebrated her victory. She thought my silence meant surrender. It meant I was loading the cannon. The sheriff served Margaret on a Tuesday morning. Lily texted me, "It just happened. Sheriff at the door." Mom's face went white when she saw the envelope. I'd timed it deliberately. Tuesday morning, when Richard would be at work, when Margaret would be alone. I wanted her to face this moment without anyone to immediately spin it for her, without Richard there to comfort her or help her strategize. Just Margaret and 40 pages of detailed allegations backed by hundreds of pages of exhibits proving everything she'd done. The complaint was comprehensive. My attorney had spent weeks crafting it to be airtight. Fraud, conspiracy to defraud, intentional infliction of emotional distress. Elder abuse, because Margaret had manipulated Richard after he turned 65, which triggered specific state protections. We detailed everything. The fake DNA test with specific evidence of Margaret's access to Clearview Health Services. Financial records showing payments to Dr. Hammond's clinic. Emails proving premeditation. Margaret's handwritten notes outlining phases of destruction. The timeline connecting Emma's death 37 years ago to my systematic destruction. Clear revenge motive documented over decades. We asked for $15 million in compensatory and punitive damages, full restoration of my inheritance rights, disgorgement of all benefits Margaret had received through fraud. Richard was served simultaneously at his office, not as a defendant, but as a material witness. He'd be required to testify under oath about everything he knew, everything he'd chosen not to question. The news hit their social circle within hours. I knew it would. 50 people had witnessed my public humiliation at that birthday party. Now all of them were learning there was far more to the story. Margaret's world crumbled with a speed that was almost satisfying to watch. The country club called her 2 days after she was served. Lily overheard the phone conversation. They asked for Margaret's resignation from the board. Not requested, asked. Too much negative attention, you understand. We think it's best for everyone if you step down immediately. Margaret had been on that board for 12 years. She'd chaired major fundraising events. None of it mattered now. The charity organizations where she'd been a major donor followed within the week. Leadership positions quietly eliminated. Invitations to events stopped coming. Her name removed from donor recognition materials. They didn't make announcements. They just erased her the way she'd erased my mother. Friends she'd known for decades suddenly couldn't take her calls. "I'm sorry, I have a prior commitment." "This isn't a good time. I'll call you back." But they never did. Margaret had built her entire identity on being the devoted wife, the caring stepmother, the pillar of the community. Watching that identity disintegrate must have been excruciating. The rewriting of history was almost amusing in its predictability. People who'd known Margaret for years suddenly remembered thinking something was off about her. She was always a little too perfect, wasn't she? I always felt her devotion to Richard seemed performative. Poor Heather. I feel terrible we didn't see what was happening. The same people who'd laughed at my humiliation now expressed outrage at Margaret's cruelty. They were rewriting their own complicity, making themselves innocent bystanders rather than participants in my destruction. But I watched it happen with grim satisfaction. This was what Margaret had feared most, not the money, not even potential prison time, but the exposure. The loss of her carefully constructed image. Being seen for what she really was. Then the state attorney general's office got involved. My attorney had flagged potential criminal violations when we filed the civil suit. The AG's office reviewed the evidence and opened a formal investigation. Fraud was obvious. The fake DNA test created at a clinic where Margaret had access and influence paid for with traceable funds. But the elder abuse angle was what made them move quickly. Margaret had manipulated Richard into disinheriting his biological daughter after he'd turned 65. Under state law that triggered enhanced protections and penalties, Margaret hired a top criminal defense firm. They advised immediate silence. No public statements, no contact with me or any potential witnesses. But they also, according to Lily, who somehow heard this from Richard, told Margaret privately that she should consider a plea deal. The evidence was overwhelming, documented across decades, corroborated by multiple sources, including her own handwritten notes. In desperation, Margaret tried one final manipulation. Her attorneys filed a motion arguing that Richard had always known deep down that I was his biological daughter, that the DNA test had just been Richard's excuse to justify emotional distance he already felt. She was trying to throw my father completely under the bus to save herself. But Richard's journal entries destroyed that strategy, the ones Lily had found in his safe. They proved Richard had genuinely believed the test had struggled with doubt, but ultimately accepted Margaret's lies. Margaret's attempt to shift all blame onto him backfired spectacularly, and it destroyed whatever loyalty Richard had left. Lily said he went quiet and cold in a way she'd never seen. His wife of 33 years was willing to sacrifice him completely to avoid consequences for her own actions. Margaret had lost everything: control of the narrative, her social standing, legal high ground, Richard's protection. Every carefully built escape route was collapsing. Every escape route she'd built was collapsing, and she had nowhere left to run. Richard's deposition was scheduled 3 weeks after the lawsuit was filed. My attorney asked if I wanted to be present in the room. I said yes. I needed to see his face when he was finally forced to tell the truth under oath. We sat in a conference room at my attorney's office. Richard, his lawyer. My attorney, a court reporter. Richard looked terrible. Gaunt, aged like he'd lost 20 pounds and 10 years of life in the past month. His hands shook slightly as he was sworn in. My attorney started with simple questions, establishing timeline, confirming basic facts. Then she got to the core of it. Mr. Brown, after you received the DNA test results 14 years ago, did you ever seek a second test from an independent laboratory? No. Did you ever personally investigate the credentials or procedures of Clearview Family Health Services where the test was performed? No. Did you know that the medical director, Dr. Patricia Hammond, was your wife Margaret's close friend and former employer? Long pause. Richard's lawyer whispered something to him. No, I didn't know that. After receiving the DNA test results, did you notice your treatment of Heather changed dramatically? His voice was barely audible. Yes. Can you describe how your treatment changed? I became distant, cold. I held her to higher standards than I held Lily. I stopped showing her affection. Did Heather do anything to deserve that treatment? The pause stretched. Tears formed in his eyes. No, she didn't. Did you ever tell Heather why you'd become cold toward her? Explain that you believed she wasn't biologically yours. No. So she spent 14 years not understanding why her father stopped loving her. Richard broke down completely, couldn't answer through the sobs. My attorney waited, let the court reporter capture every second of his breakdown. After 3 hours of testimony, Richard had admitted everything: his willful blindness, his cowardice, his choice to believe a convenient lie rather than face uncomfortable truth. After the deposition, he tried to contact me, called my phone 16 times over 2 days. I didn't answer. He showed up at my apartment on a Saturday morning. I saw him through the peephole standing in the hallway looking broken. I didn't open the door. 3 days later, a letter arrived. Handwritten, his usually neat writing shaky and barely legible. Heather, I know I'm sorry is meaningless and inadequate. I know I can't undo 14 years of coldness, of making you feel unwanted, of failing you in every way a father can fail a daughter. Margaret lied to me, but I chose to believe her because it was easier than admitting I was a bad father who couldn't love his own child the way she deserved. You deserved a father who fought for you, who questioned suspicious evidence, who chose you over his own comfort. I was weak and cowardly, and you paid the price. I'm changing my will to restore your full inheritance, but I know that's not what you really lost. You lost your childhood. You lost your father. And that's entirely on me." I read it once, put it in my desk drawer. I couldn't process forgiveness yet. Didn't know if I ever could. 2 weeks later, Lily called at 6 in the morning. "Dad's in the hospital. Heart attack. It's bad." The stress had finally broken him physically. Massive cardiac event. They'd done emergency surgery. He was stable but critical. Margaret, despite facing criminal charges and social exile, immediately transformed back into the devoted wife. Lily said she was at the hospital every day bringing flowers, performing grief and concern for the nurses and doctors. I wondered if she actually cared, or if this was just more theater maintaining her image even as everything crumbled. My attorney called. "If he dies before changing his will, we have problems. The current will leaves everything to Margaret and Lily." "Then let him die with his choices," I said. My voice sounded cold even to my own ears. "I won't beg a dying man for what should have been freely given." But 3 days later, I went to the hospital anyway. Not for Richard. For myself. I needed to say certain things needed closure that could only come from speaking truth directly to him. I waited until Margaret left for lunch, walked into his room. He was awake, monitors beeping steadily. He looked startled to see me, then hopeful. That hope made me angry. "You were supposed to protect me," I said, standing at the foot of his bed. "That was your job as my father. You didn't. Margaret gave you an excuse to stop loving me, but you were already looking for one." He started to speak. I held up my hand. "That's what hurts most. Not that she lied, but that you wanted to believe it. Somewhere deep down you wanted permission to favor Lily to push me away. The DNA test just gave you a reason you could live with. I forgive you because holding this anger will only poison me. But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. You don't get to be my father anymore. That opportunity died years ago. You killed it through 14 years of coldness and 37 years of choosing comfort over courage." He reached for my hand. I stepped back. "Goodbye, Richard." I left him crying, understanding finally that forgiveness without relationship was the loneliest gift he could receive. He wanted my forgiveness to ease his guilt, but forgiveness doesn't heal what he broke. Before Margaret's criminal trial could begin, I made a request through my attorney. One final meeting. Not in a courtroom or conference room, but at a specific location I'd chosen carefully. Emma's grave. Margaret's lawyer called it highly unusual. My attorney said it was my choice. Margaret surprisingly agreed to come. She arrived with her lawyer on a gray Saturday morning. She was wearing an ankle monitor, a condition of her bail. She looked smaller than I remembered, diminished. Not physically, but in presence. The perfect mask she'd maintained for decades had cracked, and what showed through was just a tired, aging woman who'd spent her entire life on revenge that brought her nothing. We stood before the small headstone. Emma Rose Brown, born sleeping into the arms of angels. "I found her," I said. "Your daughter, the one you lost 37 years ago. She'd be my age, 38. You wanted me to feel what you felt, erased, replaced, unmourned. And I did. For most of my life, I felt exactly that." Margaret's mask cracked completely. "Don't. You don't have any right to talk about her." "I have every right. You made your grief into a weapon and pointed it at me for 37 years. I was 3 years old when you came into my life, Margaret. I'd done nothing except exist. You think you understand," her voice was rising, breaking. "You have no idea what it's like to lose a child." And then she collapsed. Not dramatically, not staged, just dropped to her knees at Emma's grave and broke. 37 years of buried grief finally tearing through the vengeance that had held her together. "She was real," Margaret sobbed. "She had fingernails and eyelashes and my nose. And Sarah was there when it happened. I'll never know if she pushed me or if I slipped or if it was just a terrible accident." But when I woke up in that hospital, my baby was gone. And 2 months later, Sarah was pregnant with you." She looked up at me, mascara running, all pretense gone. "She took everything. Richard, the life I should have had, even my right to grieve properly. Everyone said, 'Move on, forgive, these things happen.' No one let me mourn Emma. She was erased like she never mattered, like her death was just an inconvenience to get past. So when Sarah died, I came back. And I made her daughter feel invisible, unwanted, like she'd never belonged, exactly what they did to my Emma." Her voice was empty now. "It was justice." I knelt beside her in the grass. "It wasn't justice. It was trauma passing itself down through generations. You were hurt, so you hurt me. The cycle didn't heal anything. It just created more damage." She looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. "You could have told Richard the truth about Emma, about your pain," I said quietly. "Maybe he would have helped you heal. Instead, you turned grief into a weapon and swung it at an innocent child for decades." For the first time in 37 years, Margaret really looked at me. Not as Sarah's daughter, not as the child who lived while Emma died, just as a person. "You're right," she whispered. "I can't take any of it back. I can't undo your childhood or give you the father you deserved. Emma's death broke something in me, and I never let it heal. I fed it instead, let it grow into something monstrous. And you, a 3-year-old child who'd just lost her mother, you became the target of all that poison." I stayed kneeling beside her. "I know what happened to you was unimaginable. Losing a child should break a person. But destroying another mother's child didn't bring Emma back. It just ensured more people would carry trauma forward. I can't forgive what you did to me, but I can acknowledge that you were broken too, and I'm sorry no one helped you heal before you became this." We stayed there by Emma's grave for another hour, not talking much, just existing in that space between victim and perpetrator, between understanding and accountability. The following week, Margaret accepted a plea agreement. Guilty to fraud and conspiracy. 3 years in state prison, eligible for parole after 18 months. $7 million in restitution to me. Complete forfeiture of any claim to Richard's estate. At her sentencing, Margaret spoke publicly about Emma for the first time in decades. About loss, about how grief had metastasized into cruelty. The judge listened, then responded with measured firmness. "Mrs. Brown, your loss was real and your pain was valid, but you chose to inflict that pain on an innocent child for 37 years. You had many opportunities to seek help, to heal, to break the cycle. You chose revenge instead. That is unforgivable." Margaret went to prison. Not broken, but finally quiet. The vengeance that had sustained her for nearly 4 decades was spent. She'd lost everything she tried to steal, and gained nothing but the truth she'd denied for 37 years. 6 months after Margaret went to prison, the probate court issued its ruling. Richard's most recent will, the one that had left everything to Margaret and Lily, that had effectively erased me from the family entirely, was void. Fraud in the inducement, the judge ruled, created under deliberately false pretenses. I was legally restored as Richard's daughter and rightful heir, full inheritance rights. Everything in writing, official, stamped and sealed. Richard, who'd partially recovered from his heart attack but would never be truly healthy again, agreed to revise his will. 50% to me, 40% to Lily, 10% to cancer research in Sarah's name. Lily didn't contest it. She'd received enough from Margaret's side of the family, and more importantly, she wanted nothing more to do with any of this. I sat in my attorney's office when she told me the final numbers. The estate was worth more than I'd realized. I would receive millions. Financial security for life. I felt nothing. "This is what you fought for," my attorney said gently, clearly expecting some reaction. "I fought for the truth," I said. "The money's just paperwork." Because winning in court didn't undo 37 years of emotional damage. Legal vindication didn't erase the little girl who'd spent her entire childhood trying to understand why her father couldn't love her. Justice and healing, I was learning, were completely different things. Achieving one didn't automatically grant the other. I started intensive therapy 3 times a week. My therapist, Dr. Patricia Chen, specialized in what she called complex developmental trauma, abuse, so subtle and sustained that victims internalize it as normal as deserved. "You were gaslighted your entire life," she explained in our first session, "into believing your exclusion was your fault, that you were fundamentally unlovable. That kind of conditioning doesn't disappear because a court said you were right. Your nervous system is still running patterns established over decades." She was right. I had nightmares constantly. Recurring dreams of being very small, reaching up for my father, him turning away. Dreams of Margaret's cold smile. Dreams of standing outside a warm-lit house, pressing my face against the glass, seeing my family inside but unable to get in no matter how hard I knocked. Some days I couldn't get out of bed. The weight of 37 years would press down on me so heavily I couldn't breathe, couldn't function. I'd call in sick to work, I'd gone back part-time, and just lie there staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that existing was worth the effort. "Healing takes time," Dr. Chen said during one particularly dark session. "Often as long as the damage took to create. You're not trying to forget the past. You're trying to build a present where the past no longer controls every response, every relationship, every sense of your own worth." 4 months after the legal resolution, I did something I'd been thinking about for weeks. I legally changed my name. Not my surname. I kept Brown, defiantly refusing to let Margaret erase me, but I added my mother's maiden name as my middle name. Heather Sarah Brown. It felt like reclaiming something stolen, honoring the mother who'd been so thoroughly erased that I'd grown up feeling like I'd materialized from nothing. I started researching Sarah properly, not just looking for legal documents and timelines, but trying to understand who she'd been as a person. I reached out to distant relatives who'd known her, collected stories and memories. My mother had loved watercolor painting. She'd been gentle, maybe too trusting. Several people told me she'd been kind almost to a fault, always seeing the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it. She'd made a terrible mistake with Margaret and Richard, whether she'd pushed Margaret down those stairs or not, whether she'd deliberately pursued Richard or just been weak in a moment of shared grief, but she hadn't deserved to have her entire existence erased. I started painting. I'd never tried it before, assumed I had no artistic talent, but I found it soothing, meditative. A connection to Sarah I'd never had. I wasn't good at it, but that didn't matter. It felt like she was teaching me something across the decades of her absence. Richard kept trying to rebuild our relationship. He called weekly, asked to meet for lunch, sent emails about moving forward and not letting the past define us. I agreed to minimal contact. Once every 2 months, supervised lunch at a public restaurant. No expectations of warmth or reconciliation. Just 2 people sharing a meal, maintaining a cordial distance. He kept hoping for more. At one lunch about 5 months after Margaret's sentencing, he asked with heartbreaking hopefulness, "Will you ever be able to call me Dad again?" I considered the question carefully. He deserved honesty at least. "I don't know. You'd have to earn that. And I'm not sure either of us has enough time left for that kind of redemption." His face fell, but he nodded, understanding finally that some damage is irreversible. Some relationships can't be repaired, only acknowledged and mourned. I'd won my name back, but the cost was learning that some relationships, once broken, stay that way. A year after the legal battles ended, I used $2 million from the restitution money to establish a nonprofit foundation. I named it carefully, deliberately, the Emma and Sarah Fund for Victims of Family Fraud. The name honored both the child Margaret lost and the mother I lost. It acknowledged that hurt people, that trauma passes down through generations unless someone makes the conscious choice to break the cycle. Margaret had chosen to perpetuate her pain. I chose differently. The foundation provided legal assistance and therapy funding for victims of inheritance fraud, parental alienation, family exploitation. All the ways family members weaponize love and money and belonging to control and destroy each other. Within the first year, we'd helped 23 families. Children who'd discovered they'd been written out of wills through manipulation. Elderly parents being financially exploited by caregivers. Siblings turned against each other through systematic lies. Each case was different in details, but the same in essence. Someone had taken advantage of trust and family bonds to cause devastating harm. I hired staff who understood trauma from the inside social workers, attorneys, therapists who'd experienced family betrayal themselves. We didn't just provide services, we provided witness. We said what happened to you was real and it wasn't your fault and you deserved better. That felt like victory in a way the legal judgment never had. Not revenge, redemption. Richard died 18 months after Margaret went to prison. Heart failure, the doctor said. Complicated by years of alcohol use and unmanaged stress. His body had finally given out under the weight of guilt he'd carried too late. He'd kept his promise about the will. That was the last thing he did right. The funeral was small. Richard hadn't maintained many friendships in his final years. Most of the guests were business associates who came out of obligation. I sat in the back row, neither family nor stranger, something uncomfortable in between. Lily gave the eulogy. She'd come back from Portland for this, though she'd told me on the phone she was leaving again immediately after. Her words were honest in a way that made people shift uncomfortably in their seats. Dad was complicated. She said, her voice steady but sad. He loved us, but he also failed us in different devastating ways. He was weak when we needed strength. He believed lies when he should have fought for truth. In his final 18 months, he tried to make amends. Whether that was enough isn't for me to judge. After the service, I walked to the casket, placed a single white rose on the polished wood. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation. Just acknowledgement that he'd existed, that he'd been my father once, that it had meant something, even if that something had been mostly pain. Then I walked away without looking back. 3 months later, a letter arrived from Portland. Lily's handwriting on the envelope. "I'm moving permanently," she wrote. "I need distance from all of this, the family, the house, the memories, the guilt that follows me everywhere here. I hope someday we can know each other without the weight of Mom and Dad between us. But right now, every time I see you, I'm reminded of what I had and what you didn't, and I can't separate my happy childhood from the fact that it was deliberately built on your suffering. I'm so sorry. I know that's inadequate, but I mean it. Maybe in 5 years, 10 years, we can try again. For now, I need to figure out who I am separate from being the golden child the weapon Mom used against you." I read the letter twice, then filed it in a drawer. I understood completely. Some wounds need space, not forced closeness. Maybe Lily and I would find each other again someday. Maybe we wouldn't. Either way was okay. Around that same time, I realized something that felt like the final piece of healing clicking into place. I was no longer waiting for anyone's validation. I wasn't waiting for Richard's love, he'd taken that to his grave. I wasn't waiting for Margaret's admission that she'd been wrong, she'd made her choices, and was living with them in prison. I wasn't waiting for Lily's friendship, or for the family I'd always desperately wanted to materialize and accept me. I'd spent 37 years trying to earn something that should have been given freely. Trying to be good enough, perfect enough, small enough, quiet enough, lovable enough to deserve love that was being deliberately withheld. Now I understood I didn't need to earn my worth. I didn't need anyone's permission to exist fully. I didn't need external validation to know I had value. I was enough. Not despite everything that had happened, but including it. The trauma was part of me now woven into who I'd become, but it wasn't all of me. The girl who'd been told she didn't belong had finally stopped asking for a place at someone else's table and started building her own. I'd been fighting for acceptance my entire life until I realized I only needed my own. Margaret was released from prison after 21 months. Early release for good behavior and participation in grief counseling programs. I received a standard notification letter from the state. "You are being informed that Margaret Brown has been released from custody and may attempt to contact you." I filed the letter and went about my day. I didn't attend her release. didn't track her movements, didn't wonder where she went or what she'd do with whatever life she had left. My lawyer mentioned in passing that Margaret had moved to a small town in Arizona, was living with a distant cousin working part-time at a library. I nodded and changed the subject. There was a letter. Margaret had written to me from prison, 12 pages, my lawyer said supposedly full of apologies and reflections. It arrived at my apartment 3 weeks after her release, forwarded through my attorney. I held the unopened envelope for maybe 30 seconds. Then I donated it, still sealed, to the Foundation's archive. We kept examples of perpetrator correspondence for educational purposes, showing the patterns of manipulation, even in supposed apologies. Whatever Margaret needed to say, I didn't need to hear. I'd moved on. Her words wouldn't change anything. Occasionally over the following months, I'd hear things about her through distant connections. Someone who knew someone who'd run into her. Margaret was in therapy, finally processing Emma's death properly after 38 years. She'd apparently broken down in a grocery store when she saw a mother with a newborn. She was working on making amends, though she'd been advised not to contact me directly. Part of me hoped she found peace, that she was finally healing from the trauma that had twisted her into someone capable of decades-long cruelty. A smaller, harder part hoped she never found peace, hoped the weight of what she'd done followed her every day for the rest of her life. Mostly, though, I felt nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction, not even real curiosity. Just indifference. Margaret had taken up enormous space in my life for so long, first as the cold stepmother who made me feel small, then as the revealed villain, the architect of my destruction. For years, understanding her, defeating her, making her face consequences had consumed me. Now she was just someone who used to matter. Someone who'd once had power over my sense of self, but didn't anymore. That indifference felt like the truest form of freedom. In December of that year, 3 years after the birthday party that had destroyed and rebuilt my life, I received a Christmas card from Lily. The envelope was postmarked Portland. Inside was a photo of Lily standing in front of a small house, mountains in the background, a golden retriever at her feet, her arm around someone who I assumed was a partner. The note was brief: wishing you peace this season, L. No long letter, no attempt at reconciliation, just acknowledgement that we both still existed in the world. I put the card on my mantel next to other photos. My therapist, Dr. Chen, and her family, who'd invited me to Thanksgiving. My colleague Marcus from the Foundation, who'd become a genuine friend. A woman named Jennifer I'd met at a grief support group who understood family trauma from the inside. Photos from a weekend trip I'd taken with people I'd met through a painting class. These were my people now. My chosen family. Not connected to me by biology or shared history of pain, but by mutual respect and genuine care. I'd learned that family wasn't about DNA. It was about showing up consistently, about seeing each other fully and choosing to stay, about reciprocal care that didn't have conditions attached. Biology didn't guarantee any of that. Conscious choice did. The inheritance from Richard had been substantial. More money than I'd ever imagined having. I'd worked with financial advisors to invest it carefully. Kept enough for security and freedom. I'd never have to worry about money again. And that was its own kind of peace. Donated significantly to causes Sarah had cared about: art education programs for underserved kids, cancer research specifically focused on the type that had killed her. Put millions into the Foundation's endowment so it could continue helping families long after I was gone. I didn't live lavishly, moved to a modest 2-bedroom apartment with good light for painting, drove a reliable hybrid, lived simply and comfortably. Money had never been the point of fighting. The money was just formal recognition, legal acknowledgement of what had been stolen. But I'd learned something important. I didn't need their money to build a life worth living. I'd already done that. Through my own work, my own choices, my own stubborn refusal to let them define my worth. The inheritance just ensured I'd never again have to depend on people who didn't value me. Never need validation from those who deliberately withheld it. That was the real freedom it provided, complete independence from needing them in any way. I'd spent years fighting for what they owed me until I realized I'd already built more without them. 4 years after the birthday party that had shattered my world and forced me to rebuild it from the ground up, I stood in my office looking out at the city and barely recognized the person I'd become. I'd started my own consulting firm 18 months earlier. Small operation, just me and 2 associates, but we were doing meaningful work. Healthcare ethics and compliance consulting, patient advocacy programs, helping organizations build systems that protected vulnerable people from the kind of exploitation I'd experienced. I used my background in healthcare administration, but also my hard-won expertise in recognizing manipulation, in identifying the subtle ways power gets abused in family systems and institutional settings. The work felt like purpose, not just a paycheck. Organizations actually wanted my perspective, valued what I'd learned through surviving Margaret's decades-long campaign. I'd turned my trauma into professional expertise, and people paid me well for it. I traveled now, not running from anything but exploring for joy. I'd been to Italy last spring, spent 2 weeks in Tuscany taking watercolor classes and eating food that made me understand why people write poetry about simple ingredients. Japan in the fall, where the precision and beauty of everything from tea ceremonies to train schedules felt like a meditation on intentionality. New Zealand over Christmas, hiking through landscapes so beautiful they made my chest ache. These were places I'd dreamed about but never prioritized when I was spending all my energy trying to earn love from people determined not to give it. Now I prioritized joy, adventure, beauty. Things that filled me up rather than drained me. I had real friendships now. Not relationships built on family obligation or shared trauma, but genuine connections with people who saw me fully and chose to stay. Jennifer from the grief support group, who understood family betrayal from the inside and never made me explain why certain holidays were hard. Marcus from the foundation, who'd become one of my closest friends despite, or maybe because of the fact that he'd investigated my family and seen all the ugliest truths. Colleagues, neighbors, people from my painting class who knew me as Heather, the person, not Heather the victim, or Heather the fighter. I'd even started dating. His name was David, an architect I'd met through a friend of a friend. Nothing serious yet. My attachment wounds were deep enough that I moved cautiously, watching for red flags, protecting myself. But it was genuine. He valued me without needing me to be smaller, didn't try to fix me or save me, just appreciated who I was, including the complicated parts. In one of my recent therapy sessions, Dr. Chen had noted the shift with a small smile. You used to come in asking how to make people love you. Now you discuss how to love yourself and how to recognize when others genuinely do. That shift, Heather, is revolutionary. She was right. The change felt tectonic. I'd spent 37 years believing love was something I had to earn through perfect behavior. Now I understood it was something freely given or not worth having. One Saturday afternoon, cleaning out old files to make room for new work documents, I found an envelope I'd forgotten about. Inside were childhood photos, the ones Margaret had packed away, that I'd eventually recovered from relatives during my investigation. I hadn't looked at them in over a year. I spread them out on my kitchen table. There I was at 5, standing slightly apart from the family group at a holiday gathering. At 7, out of focus in the background while Lily and Richard posed in sharp clarity. At 10, positioned at the very edge of a birthday photo, easy to crop out. The pattern was undeniable once you saw it. But what struck me most was the little girl's face. The way I'd looked at the camera with that careful, uncertain expression. The body language that said I was already learning to take up less space, to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention came my way. For years, whenever I had looked at these photos, I'd asked, what did I do wrong? Why wasn't I enough? Now, looking at that small face with 4 years of healing and adult understanding, I felt something different. Protective rage. That child had done nothing wrong. Nothing. She'd deserved love, safety, belonging. She'd deserved a father who fought for her and a stepmother who didn't see her as a target for revenge. She'd been sabotaged before she could even speak, set up to fail at earning love that was being deliberately withheld. The failure had never been hers. The adults around her had failed spectacularly, had chosen comfort over courage, revenge over healing weakness over strength. Adult Heather had finally given that little girl what she'd always needed: someone to fight for her, someone to believe her, someone to say clearly and firmly, "You deserved love and the failure wasn't yours." I carefully put the photos back in the envelope. I didn't need to look at them often anymore. But I kept them as a reminder, not of pain, but of survival, of how far I'd come. Later that week, I was having coffee with Jennifer when she asked about my family. It was a casual question. She'd been telling me about her own complicated relationship with her mother, and she wondered if I'd heard from anyone. "No," I said. Then I realized something that made me pause mid-sip. "Actually, I don't think I've thought about any of them in months. 3 months, maybe more." Jennifer raised her eyebrows. "That's growth." It was. For so long, they'd been the center of my universe. First, I'd fought desperately to please them, to earn their love. Then I'd fought to defeat them, to expose their lies and get justice. Now I simply didn't think about them at all. I wasn't bitter. Wasn't waiting for additional closure or more apologies. Wasn't hoping they'd finally understand what they'd done or feel appropriate remorse. I'd simply moved on. They were part of my history, had shaped me undeniably, but no longer defined my present or future. They'd taken years from me that I couldn't recover. I refused to give them any more time, any more energy, any more space in my thoughts. The best revenge I'd discovered wasn't destruction or exposure or even justice. It was indifference. It was building a life so full and meaningful that they became irrelevant. One morning, getting ready for a meeting with a new client, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror and actually stopped to look. Really look. I saw someone I genuinely liked. Strong, scarred, surviving, thriving. My hair had some gray in it. Now I'd stopped dyeing it, let it show. Lines around my eyes from smiling more in the past 2 years than I had in the previous 35. A confidence in my posture that hadn't been there before. I'd never be over what happened. Trauma doesn't work that way. It doesn't disappear just because you want it to. It doesn't resolve into neat before and after stories like some inspirational movie. I still had nightmares occasionally. Still had days where the weight of it all pressed down, and I had to be gentle with myself, take time to rest and recover. But I'd integrated it, made it part of my story without letting it be the whole story. I was no longer defined by what had been done to me, but by what I'd built despite it. By how I'd transformed pain into purpose, trauma, into expertise, isolation, into connection. The foundation was thriving. We'd helped over 100 families now, with more reaching out every month. My consulting work was fulfilling and respected. My relationships were healthy and reciprocal. I had hobbies that brought me joy: painting, hiking, cooking, elaborate meals for friends. I had a life I'd built intentionally, piece by piece, based on what I valued rather than what others expected. I'd taken the worst thing that ever happened to me and transmuted it into something meaningful. Not because I had to prove anything to anyone. Not because I needed to justify my existence or earn my place in the world. But because I'd proven to myself that I could survive anything and still choose to live fully. That was the real gift I'd given myself. Not revenge. Not even justice, though that had mattered. The gift was choosing to build a life worth living, regardless of what had been taken from me. I looked at the woman in the mirror, strong, scarred, whole, and smiled. I'd spent 37 years being someone's shadow, and it took 4 to become my own light. 5 years after that birthday party, I was invited to speak at the National Conference on Family Law Reform in Chicago. 200 attorneys, judges, family court advocates, legal scholars. The organizer had read about my case in a law journal article and thought my perspective would be valuable. I almost said no. Public speaking wasn't something I enjoyed, and revisiting the story in detail was still exhausting even after all the healing work I'd done. But the organizer explained, "We need practitioners to understand that family abuse isn't always visible. Your case illustrates systemic failures we need to address." So I said yes. Standing at that podium, looking out at 200 professionals whose decisions would shape countless families' futures, I felt the weight of responsibility. This wasn't about me anymore. It was about every child who'd grow up feeling unwanted without understanding why every person who'd be gaslit into believing their exclusion was their fault. I told my story methodically, not for sympathy or attention, but to illustrate how sophisticated family manipulation can be, how it exploits every assumption our legal and social systems make about parental love. Family courts operate on an assumption that parental love is the default. I said, my voice steady. That blood ties guarantee protection, that parents want what's best for their children. These assumptions are correct most of the time. But when they're wrong, the damage is catastrophic. I walked them through it. Margaret's 37-year campaign. The fake DNA test that no one questioned because why would a stepmother lie about something so fundamental? The systematic erasure of my mother. The manipulation so subtle that I internalized it as my own failure. The public humiliation that everyone witnessed but no one stopped. The systems meant to protect children enabled her every step, I continued. Because she performed devotion convincingly. She attended school events, baked birthday cakes, said all the right things in public. No mandated reporter ever suspected abuse because there were no visible bruises, no overt cruelty. Just steady, methodical psychological destruction that looked like normal family dynamics to anyone who wasn't living it. I paused, let that sink in. We have to do better. Children shouldn't have to wait until they're adults to be believed. They shouldn't have to hire private investigators and attorneys to prove they deserved love. They shouldn't have to spend decades of therapy undoing damage that could have been prevented if one adult had looked closely enough to see the truth. I talked about the specific reforms needed. Better training for recognizing psychological abuse. Protocols for investigating parental alienation claims without defaulting to assumptions about which parent is telling the truth. Accountability for fraudulent DNA testing. Legal remedies that don't require victims to have massive financial resources. Family abuse is still abuse. I said, looking at faces in the audience who were taking notes, nodding. Even when it's subtle, even when it's psychological, even when there are no bruises to photograph, we need to expand our definitions of what constitutes harm and create systems that can identify and stop it before it destroys entire childhoods. When I finished, the audience stood. Not just polite applause, but something that felt like recognition. Afterward, at least 30 attorneys approached me with questions. How do you identify these patterns early? What red flags should we watch for? How do we protect clients from similar manipulation? Can we refer cases to your foundation? My pain was becoming systemic change. That felt like the highest form of victory, not personal revenge, but preventing future victims from experiencing what I'd survived. Flying home from Chicago, exhausted but satisfied, I thought about all the ways this story could have ended differently. If I'd given up after the birthday party, if I'd accepted Margaret's narrative at the family meeting, if I'd let the defeat break me instead of using it to fuel strategic patience. At home organizing papers on my desk, I found an old letter I'd written to Richard years ago. I drafted it maybe 6 months after he died, when I was still processing anger and grief in therapy. I'd never sent it, never intended to. But I'd kept it because writing it had been important. I read it again now with 5 years of distance. Dear Dad, you asked me once what you could do to make this right. The answer is nothing. Time doesn't run backward. Childhoods don't get do-overs. There's no makeup test for parenting, no way to retake the exam you failed for 37 years. But here's what you did give me unintentionally. You taught me that love must be demonstrated through consistent action, not just claimed in words. That family is chosen through how people treat us, not obligatory through biology. That I'd rather be alone than diminished, rather be authentic than accommodated. Those lessons were painful to learn. They cost me years of therapy, decades of self-doubt, a childhood I'll never get back. But they've served me well in building a life where I'm valued, where I value myself, where I don't accept crumbs and call them a feast. So thank you, I guess, for showing me exactly who I didn't want to become. For demonstrating through your failure what real love looks like in its absence. For being such a clear example of what weakness and cowardice do to the people who depend on you. I hope you found some peace before you died. But I also hope you died knowing exactly what you'd done and couldn't undo. That's the gift I gave you, truth that couldn't be explained away or forgotten. It's the heaviest gift I could give, and you earned it. I'd never sent it because I realized he didn't need to read it and I didn't need him to. Writing it had been enough. It was closure I gave myself, not something I needed him to receive or acknowledge. I put the letter back in the desk drawer. Maybe someday I'd throw it away. Or maybe I'd keep it as a reminder of how far I'd come, of the person I used to be, who still needed to direct words at him, even after he was gone. Once a year I visited Emma's grave. Not for Margaret, I owed her nothing, and didn't think about her much anymore. But for the baby who'd never lived, whose death had set off a chain of pain that affected so many people across decades. I went on the anniversary of her death, March 15th. Brought yellow roses because they symbolize remembrance without the romantic implications of red. Sat by the small headstone, and talked to a child who'd never breathed. I'm sorry you never got to live, Emma. I'm sorry that what happened to you became a weapon. You deserved better. So did your mother before grief twisted her into something monstrous. So did I. 5 years of therapy had given me enough distance to hold complexity. Margaret was both villain and victim, abuser and wounded, the perpetrator of terrible harm and the carrier of unhealed trauma. Understanding that didn't excuse anything, didn't mean I forgave her or wanted her in my life. But it allowed me to release the anger that had been poisoning me. Margaret had been given a choice after Emma died. Get help for grief or weaponize it, heal or hurt, break the cycle or perpetuate it. She'd chosen wrong, and I'd paid the price for decades. But I was choosing differently, transforming my pain into healing for others, building systems to protect future victims, breaking the cycle rather than passing it forward. That's how generational trauma ends. Someone has to be brave enough, strong enough, healed enough to stop passing it down, to say the pain stops here with me, and I won't let it reach the next generation. I like to think Emma would approve of that, would want her death to mean something beyond the revenge it fueled, would want the pain to end rather than multiply. I named the foundation after you and my mother, I told the small headstone. The Emma and Sarah Fund, because hurt people, but we can choose to break that cycle. I broke it. It stops with me. Driving home from the cemetery, I thought about that birthday party 5 years ago. The photograph I'd given my father, Sarah, pregnant and glowing Richard's younger self, looking at her with pure joy. For our daughter, Heather, proof you were wanted from the very first moment. At the time, I'd meant it as a reminder of what he'd lost. Evidence that he'd once loved me, once wanted me before Margaret's lies poisoned everything. I'd wanted him to feel regret, to understand what he'd destroyed through his weakness and cowardice. But over the years, I'd come to understand the real gift I'd given him. Not the photograph itself, not even the message from Sarah. The gift was truth. Undeniable, uncomfortable, permanent truth that he could never unknow, never explain away, never forget. I'd forced him to confront his choices, his complicity in believing convenient lies, his cowardice in refusing to question suspicious evidence, his fundamental failure as a father to protect his daughter from someone who was systematically destroying her. He'd died knowing exactly what he'd done and couldn't repair. That knowledge had been the heaviest burden I could give, heavier than any revenge, more permanent than any punishment. I hope it haunted him. I hope he died with the full weight of his failures pressing down on him, understanding that some damage is irreversible, some relationships can't be saved, some opportunities die when you refuse to take them. Margaret had spent 37 years believing her revenge was justice, believing that destroying me would heal her pain, would balance the cosmic scales, would somehow make Emma's death mean something. She'd been wrong. She'd lost everything. Her freedom, her reputation, her husband's loyalty, her daughter's respect, and gained nothing. The pain didn't ease. Emma was still dead. The revenge brought no peace. Richard had spent his final years knowing he'd failed his daughter in the most fundamental way a father can fail. That knowledge had broken him more thoroughly than any external punishment could have. He'd wanted my forgiveness to ease his guilt, but I'd given him something harder: forgiveness without reconciliation. Release without restoration. I'd freed him from my anger, but not from his consequences. And me, I'd spent 5 years learning that the best gift you can give yourself is truth. Even when it hurts. Even when it destroys comfortable illusions. Even when it leaves you alone. Even when it costs you the family you'd always wanted. Because truth, no matter how painful, creates the foundation for genuine healing. Lies, no matter how comfortable, only deepen wounds. Margaret's lie about the DNA test poisoned my entire childhood and adolescence. Richard's lie to himself about why he couldn't love me perpetuated the damage. Even the comfortable lies I'd told myself that if I just tried harder, was better, smaller, quieter, more perfect, I could earn love that was being deliberately withheld, those lies kept me trapped. Truth was what freed me. Not legal truth, though, that helped. Not vindication in court, though, that mattered. But the deeper truth that I'd been targeted not because of any failing in me, but because of pain in someone else. That my father's rejection was about his weakness, not my worth. That I deserved love, belonging, family, and if my biological family couldn't provide, that I could build chosen family who could. The greatest gift I gave my father wasn't forgiveness. It was truth he could never undo. And the greatest gift I gave myself was the life I built from the ashes of what he destroyed. Truth doesn't always heal. Sometimes truth just reveals how deep the damage goes, how permanent some consequences are. But truth always frees. It frees you from wondering, from self-blame, from trying to earn something that was never available. It frees you to build something new rather than trying to fix something that was always broken. And freedom, real freedom, not just absence of constraint, but presence of choice, authentic choice about who you are and how you live. Freedom was all I ever really needed. I have that now. Finally, completely, irreversibly, I'm free. My story isn't just about exposing lies or reclaiming justice. It's about learning to live with the wounds others created and choosing not to pass that pain forward to the next generation. Margaret chose to turn her grief into a weapon. I chose to turn mine into purpose. If there's one lesson I want people to take from my story, it's this. Family isn't defined by blood or DNA. Real family is defined by the people who choose to stand beside you, fight for you, love you unconditionally. Never let any one parent, sibling, or relative make you feel like you have to earn love. Real love doesn't need to be earned. It's given freely and completely. And if you're living in someone else's shadow right now, trying to make yourself smaller to fit the mold they've created, remember this. You deserve to be loved exactly as you are. You don't need to be perfect. You don't need to be silent. You don't need to be small. The failure was never yours when the people who should have protected you chose to hurt you instead. Sometimes forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. Sometimes it simply means releasing the anger so you can live free. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself isn't recognition from those who hurt you, but the life you build despite them. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched you in any way, please subscribe to this channel so you don't miss other stories about survival, healing, and finding strength in unexpected places. And let me know in the comments. What do you think about Heather's decisions? Could you forgive the way she did? Would you have handled things differently? Share your thoughts. I read every comment, and your story matters too. Sometimes just knowing we're not alone in these experiences is the first step toward healing. Let's build a community where we lift each other up, where we break cycles instead of perpetuating them, where we choose light over shadow. See you in the next story.